Hey there, night owl. Yes, you the one who told yourself you would only watch 5 more minutes, and yet here we are. Come in, get comfortable, because tonight I have a story that has been waiting a very long time to be told. Not long ago, on the frozen shore of a lake in Siberia, a team of scientists opened the ground and found something that should not have been possible. Rows of small graves, children buried near each other all within the same handful of days. And when they studied what was left of those little bodies, they found the fingerprints of a disease we thought belonged only to the Middle Ages, 5,500 years too early. Before we go, though, do me a quick favour. If stories like this one pull you in, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and leave a comment below. I check every single one of them. Tell me where you're tuned in from tonight and what time it is where you are right now. I love picturing all of you scattered across the world pressing play on the very same story at completely different hours of the night. All right, go ahead and dim the lights if you have not already. Maybe switch on a fan or a little soft noise in the background, get your blanket just right, and let's slip all the way back past the pyramids, back past the wheel, back to a lake so old it did not even have a name yet. 5,500 years ago, in what we now call southeastern Siberia, there was a lake so vast that the people living beside it simply called it the sea. Cold, clear water stretched further than anyone could walk in a season. Reeds grew thick along the shallow edges. Birch trees crowded near the water roots, gripping the rocky soil, and every morning smoke rose in thin ribbons from small fires scattered along the shoreline. This was home to hunter-gatherers, a strong and steady people who'd lived beside this water for generation after generation. They did not farm. They did not build walls or grand tombs. Instead, they fished these waters with woven traps hunted along the hills behind them and buried their dead in the very same patch of earth their grandparents had chosen and their grandparents before them. In a way, those graves were how a family marked land as theirs. This shoreline belonged to them because their ancestors were sleeping beneath it layer after layer, season after season, for longer than anyone alive could count. Children grew up here learning the sound of ice breaking apart in spring, the smell of fish drying slowly over smoke, the shape of the hills where the marmots made their burrows. They knew which berries were sweet, and which ones made a stomach ache for days, which stars to watch for the turning of the seasons, and which songs their grandmothers had sung and their grandmothers before them. Winters were long and unforgiving, but summers like this one brought warmth back into the world, and with it a kind of lightness that settled over the whole camp. It was by every measure this family understood a good place to live, and a good place to raise children. We do not know the real name of the woman we are about to meet. No one wrote it down because no one here could write yet. So for tonight, let's call her Anya. Anya was known around camp for her steady hands, the way she could turn a stiff raw hide into something soft enough to wrap a newborn in. She woke before the sun that morning the way she always did. She stepped over her sleeping children, pulled her hide wrap tighter against the chill coming off the water, and went to check the fire. Her husband Boran had been gone 3 days on a hunt chasing something that mattered more than deer or fish that season, marmot. To us a marmot might sound like a strange animal to build an entire hunt around. But to Anya's people, these large burrowing creatures meant everything. Their meat could feed a family for days. Their thick fur sewn together could survive a Siberian winter that turned rivers to stone. Their teeth, polished smooth, were strung into necklaces and sewn onto burial clothes, small gifts for the dead to carry into whatever came next. Hunting marmot took patience and no small amount of nerve, waiting quiet and still beside a burrow for the animal to finally show itself. A good marmot hunt was something worth celebrating, and Anya had spent 3 days hoping her husband would come home successful, and simply come home at all. So when Boran came walking back into camp that afternoon, arms loaded with pelts, The whole camp gathered around him laughing, already smelling the fire that would cook that night's meal. Anya's 2 children, a boy of about 10, and his younger sister ran straight for their father, and for a moment everything about that afternoon felt like every other afternoon this family had shared beside this lake. That night there was a fire built higher than usual, meat passed hand to hand, hands clapping out an old rhythm everyone in camp still remembered by heart, and children falling asleep against their parents' shoulders long before the last of the stories had finished. If you had been standing on that shore that night under a sky full of stars none of us would recognize today, you never would have guessed what was already moving quietly through the camp. None of them could have. Nobody noticed, not yet, that Boren's hands were shaking a little more than they should have been from the cold. It started small. A cough here and there, easy enough to blame on smoke from the fire. A little warmth on the boy's forehead that his mother pressed her palm against and decided was nothing, probably just excitement over his father's return. Children got fevers. It happened. It always passed. Except this time it did not. Within 2 days the boy could not keep food down. His skin, when Anya touched it, felt like it was burning from somewhere deep inside, a heat that no amount of cool water from the lake could pull out of him. His breathing turned ragged, fighting its way in and out of his small chest like something was pressing against it from within. And when he finally coughed hard enough, there was blood in it. By the 3rd day, his little sister had the very same fever. Word moves quickly through a small camp. It always has. 2 tents down, a woman named Ela watched her own son grow quiet in the very same way his laughter, from the celebration only days earlier, now nowhere to be found. Then it reached another family further along the shore and another after that. Sickness has never cared who prayed hardest or loved deepest. It moved through this camp the way cold water moves through a crack in the ice, finding every opening, and it seemed to know almost cruelly exactly which door to knock on next. The camp's healer tried everything she knew. Herbs boiled into a bitter drink pressed gently past cracked lips. Smoke passed slowly over trembling bodies. Quiet songs sung low enough that only the sick child and the spirits were meant to hear them. She sat through nights she would rather forget, watching remedies that had worked before do nothing at all this time. Some of the elders began to wonder quietly if this had something to do with the hunt, if the hills that gave them meat and fur had also handed them something they were never meant to carry home. None of it slowed the fever down. Anya sat beside her son through his final night, and then only days later beside her daughter too. We cannot know exactly what she felt in that darkness beside the water, but we do not need ancient records to understand a mother's grief. Some things about being human have never changed, not in 5,000 years, not in 500, not today. We like to think of history as something that happened to other people in some other time far removed from our own comfortable lives. But grief has never really changed shape. A mother tonight sitting up with a sick child would recognize exactly what Anya felt in that darkness beside the water 5,000 years before either of them were even born. Some things, it turns out, are older than farming, older than writing, older than most of what we call civilization. Love is one of them. So is the fear of losing it. What we do know, because the ground remembered even when no one else could, is what happened next. Normally when a child died beside this lake, the community took its time. There were rituals. Red ochre pressed carefully around the small body. Marmot teeth strung and placed with love, the very same kind that had once decorated a proud hunter's catch. Songs that lasted through an entire night. Voices trading off as people grew tired so that the child was never once left in silence. Death here was slow and deliberate, a farewell ode to someone who had mattered to everyone around the fire. But that summer there simply was not time for any of that. Within one single stretch of days, more children died than this camp had lost in years. The people digging those graves worked fast and quiet, burying their small dead near each other side by side because there was not the time, and maybe not the strength left to do it any other way. Whatever comfort remained came only in numbers, in not letting a single child be laid into the ground alone. Anya, still hollow from her own loss, found herself kneeling beside Elar days later, helping dig a grave for a child that was not her own, because that is simply what this small tired community had left to give one another. Nobody beside that lake understood what was moving through their camp. They had no word for it, no shape to give it, nothing to blame beyond bad luck or an angry spirit or a curse carried home on the fur of a marmot. All they truly knew was that within one single season, an entire slice of a generation had gone quiet. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a camp after a season like that one, different from any quiet that came before it. Fewer voices at the fire, fewer footsteps racing along the shoreline, the kind of quiet that everyone notices but nobody speaks about out loud because saying it might make it more real than it already was. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, it stopped. The fires kept burning, the fish kept coming. Life, as it stubbornly does, moved forward. The survivors grew older, raised children of their own, and buried them too eventually in that very same shoreline right beside the ones the sickness had taken first. Layer over layer, generation over generation, for another 2,000 years this family kept returning their dead to the same patch of earth, never once knowing what had really happened that one terrible summer. Those graves stayed exactly where they'd been left, through the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, through the building of the pyramids, through every war and invention and empire that followed after, untouched, quiet, waiting the way only the ground can wait. Until not that many years ago, a team of archaeologists knelt in that same soil again, gloved hands moving in centimetres, soft brushes clearing away thousands of years of earth from something no shovel could ever be trusted with. Small bones laid out exactly where loving hands had placed them so long ago. A hush fell over that modern tent, not so different perhaps from the hush that once fell over this very shoreline. And there, in what was left of those little bodies, they found proof written into ancient bone and tooth of exactly what had swept through this family that summer, 5,500 years before anyone on earth would ever hear the words Black Death. And here is the question that would keep scientists awake for years afterward, the very same question we're about to spend this whole story chasing down together. How does a disease this ancient, this surly, already know how to move through an entire community, taking mostly the youngest among them centuries before it was even supposed to exist? To answer that, we have to leave this quiet shoreline for a moment and step into the strange, careful world of the people who dig up the past for a living. Because what they found buried beside Anya's children would change everything we thought we knew about how this story truly begins. That world we just stepped toward does not begin in Siberia at all. It begins thousands of years later in a small office at Oxford University, where a young archaeologist named Rarid MacLeod sat looking at a spreadsheet full of numbers that simply refused to make sense. No dramatic lighting, no dust and broken pottery scattered across a desk the way the movies like to show it. Just a laptop screen, a cold cup of tea going untouched, and a pattern in the data that kept circling back no matter how many times he tried to explain it away as noise. Here is the strange part, the part most people never get told. MacLeod and his colleagues were not hunting for plague when they found it. Nobody on that research team set out one morning and said, "Let's go prove that disease struck this shoreline thousands of years earlier than anyone thought." What they were actually doing was something far quieter, far less dramatic on paper mapping family trees. Reconstructing who was related to whom across 4 ancient burial grounds, along the coast of that same vast Siberian lake, some of the very same graves we stood beside a few minutes ago. For decades, an international research effort known as the Baikal Archaeology Project, built on cooperation between universities in Canada and Russia, had been carefully lifting bones out of that cold ground, cataloguing them, storing them, protecting them from a world that mostly forgot they existed. Entire careers were spent studying how these ancient hunter-gatherers lived, what they ate, how they moved across the landscape with the seasons, and how they buried their own. 4 cemeteries sat at the centre of that work sites with names most of us will never learn to pronounce comfortably Ostida, closest to a river mouth feeding into the lake, and further along the shoreline a quieter burial ground called Serovo. Ordinary places really, at least on the surface. The kind of ground a team could walk past 1,000 times without suspecting what it was quietly holding on to. Tucked among all of that patient, unglamorous work sat 46 sets of remains spanning a stretch of time so long it is almost hard to picture roughly 8,500 years of burials at the same handful of sites, one of the longest continuous windows into hunter-gatherer life anywhere on the planet. So picture the moment. A team pulls genetic material from these 46 individuals, mostly hoping to answer questions about kinship, about who buried whom, about which families kept returning to which patch of shoreline generation after generation. Somewhere in the middle of that painstaking process, buried inside the genetic noise, a signal starts showing up that has nothing to do with ancestry at all. The samples get run against a massive digital library of known pathogens, almost the way a fingerprint gets checked against a criminal database, and instead of coming back, empty matches start appearing, not once, repeatedly. It is a bacterium, and not just any bacterium, the very same one that would go on to empty entire cities a few thousand years later. 18 of those 46 people carried unmistakable evidence of it in their remains. That is close to 4 out of every 10 individuals tested an infection rate that frankly would alarm any modern public health office. And once the team began mapping exactly who these 18 people were in relation to one another, the picture became even stranger. Here is how that mapping actually works in plain terms. Every person carries small genetic markers passed down from their parents, a kind of inherited signature. Compare those markers across a group of skeletons, and you can start reconstructing an entire family tree without a single written record, figuring out who was a sibling, who was a parent who belonged to the same household, centuries after every one of them had turned to bone and soil. It is in its own quiet way one of the more remarkable tools archaeology has ever been handed, and the team leaned on it heavily here. Once that family tree took shape, the infection stopped looking random. This was not scattered occasional bad luck spread evenly across 2.5 centuries. The infections clustered tightly around specific families, specific bloodlines appearing and disappearing in tight little bursts rather than trickling along steadily year after year. For a little perspective on just how high that 39% figure really sits, modern public health agencies today will often step in with emergency measures long before an infection rate inside a single community climbs anywhere near that number. What these bones describe is not a mild, seasonal nuisance our ancient relatives simply shrugged off and carried on through. It is a number that even by today's standards would count as a full-blown crisis. Can I be honest with you for a second? When I first went through how this outbreak unfolded, the word that kept surfacing in my mind was not disease, it was ambush. Think about it this way for a moment, because I think the comparison actually helps. There is a real difference between the seasonal flu that quietly moves through a city every winter, present in the background almost constantly, and a sudden outbreak at a single family gathering where nearly everyone who shared a meal falls ill within days of each other. One is a slow hum, the other is a single sharp event. What these bones describe belongs firmly in that second category. Not a low background hum that this community simply lived alongside for generations, but something sudden tearing through a handful of related families within the span of a single generation, then just as we heard already, seeming to vanish almost as quickly as it came. Not one long smouldering fire, a flash flood, except it turns out that flood was not a single isolated storm. When the researchers widened their lens across the full 8,500 years of burials, they found the same pattern surfacing again hundreds of years after Anya's generation had already been laid to rest. A second wave striking a different set of families along that same shoreline, carrying a slightly different version of the very same bacterium. Whatever door had opened once beside that lake, it did not stay shut. It opened again on its own schedule to people who almost certainly had no memory left of what had happened to their grandparents' generation. There is something quietly devastating about that detail if you let it sink in. This was not one terrible summer. This community simply survived and moved past. It was a pattern stitched into the land itself, tied to whatever animal, whatever burrow, whatever ordinary piece of daily life kept handing this sickness back to them, generation after generation, long after anyone remembered why. And there is a smaller detail hiding inside all of this that connects directly back to what we just witnessed beside the water. The tight clustering within families, the way this sickness seemed to move from one relative straight to the next, matches almost exactly what researchers would expect from something spread person to person, most likely through coughing through the simple loving act of a parent, leaning close over a sick child through the night. That detail was not just a storyteller's imagination a few minutes ago. It is written into the bones themselves. There is another detail worth sitting with, one that quietly broke my heart the first time I understood it properly. The people hit hardest by this outbreak were not the oldest, the weakest, the ones you might expect a sickness to target first. They were mostly children between about 8 and 11 years old, an age where a child in this kind of community would have already been old enough to help skin game, to wander closer to burrows and dens, to start doing the small brave jobs that eventually made them a hunter or a healer in their own right. It is a small, aching detail, but it hints that this disease may have found its way in through exactly the kind of everyday contact with animals that these children were only just beginning to take on for themselves. Now here is where the story really turns interesting, and where I want you to sit with me for a moment, because this next part quietly rewrites something scientists had assumed for decades. Ask yourself this. If someone stopped you on the street and asked when large infectious outbreaks first became possible in human history, what would you guess? Farming towns, probably. Crowded early cities, packed marketplaces, animals penned close together with people, all that familiar imagery of civilization creating the perfect breeding ground for disease. That has been the standard assumption in archaeology for a long time, the tidy explanation that made outbreaks feel like the price humanity paid for building permanent settlements and living in tight quarters. Small mobile groups of hunter-gatherers were supposed to be safer from this kind of thing. Fewer people, more distance between camps, less sustained contact with crowded populations of animals. Picture the difference between a single family spread out on a camping trip in open country and a packed apartment building in the middle of a busy city. The math seemed to make sense on paper, except these numbers from beside the Siberian lake do not follow that math at all. One of the researchers on the Oxford team later admitted in about as many words that this result caught the whole group off guard. There had been a working expectation, almost an unspoken rule within the field, that outbreaks of this size simply did not happen among prehistoric hunter-gatherers, that this kind of devastation was reserved for people crammed into early farming towns. What they found beside that lake broke that rule completely. Small mobile spread out across a wild landscape, and still this community lost a devastating number of its youngest members within one single stretch of time. So maybe it was never really about how many people lived close together. Maybe it was about something older and far less tidy than we like to imagine opportunity. A single infected animal in the right place at the wrong moment, crossing paths with the right family. There is something almost humbling in that idea, if you ask me. We tend to picture prehistoric life as simple and modern life as complicated and fragile in ways our ancestors supposedly were not. But sickness has never really respected that story we like to tell ourselves. It has always been patient, opportunistic, willing to wait beside a burrow or a riverbank or a hearth for exactly the right moment to slip through. And the plague was not even the only warning sign hiding in these bones. Buried faintly alongside it, the team also picked up traces of a second infection, a different bacterial illness altogether, one also known for jumping from animals into people through close ordinary contact. On its own, that second signal was too faint to build a whole story around. But sitting right beside the plague evidence, it paints a fuller picture of a community locked in constant quiet negotiation, with the wildlife around them trading meat and fur and warmth for a risk they never fully understood they were taking on. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I would love to know your answer down in the comments. Before tonight, did you assume outbreaks like this one only became possible once humans built cities? I know I grew up believing something close to that myself. Now, the researchers did not stop at counting infections and mapping family trees. They pushed the timeline back even further, using the small changes that build up inside bacterial genetic material over generations, almost like tree rings, each one marking the slow passage of time. And what that deeper analysis suggested was quietly unsettling once it settles. In this particular strain, the one that swept through Anya's family and the families camped near them, had likely broken away from a milder, far less dangerous relative roughly 5,700 years before our own time. Possibly further east still, somewhere across the vast grasslands stretching through what we now call Central Asia, long before this bacterium ever reached the shores of that lake. Which means the story we just witnessed beside the water was never really the beginning. It was already a second chapter unfolding in a place its earliest origin story had already left behind. I find that detail almost impossible to shake once you sit with it. Somewhere out on those endless grasslands centuries before either of the outbreaks we will explore tonight, something ordinary and forgettable happened. An animal picked up a mutation it never asked for. A hunter or a herder, or maybe just an unlucky traveller, crossed paths with the wrong creature at the wrong hour. No one wrote it down because there was no one yet who could. And from that one quiet, undocumented moment, an entire branch of human history would eventually grow, one that would keep spreading, keep changing shape, and keep resurfacing at the worst possible moments for thousands of years afterward. Those grasslands, by the way, are not done with our story tonight. Keep them somewhere in the back of your mind, because we'll be standing on them again before long, and next time it will not just be a handful of families crossing paths with the sick animal. So here is what I promise you for the rest of what we uncover together tonight. We're going to follow this same bacterium as it slips out of these scattered hunting camps and eventually travels with entire nations of people, crossing continents on horseback, reshaping the genetic map of an entire landmass along the way. We're going to watch it learn a terrifying new trick, a genetic shortcut that would not exist for another few thousand years, one that finally let it ride inside something as small and as ordinary as a flea, turning a rare and unpredictable tragedy into something that could burn through an entire continent in a matter of months. And eventually we're going to walk the exact thread that connects a grieving mother beside a Siberian lake to crowded, panicked streets in medieval Europe more than 5,000 years later, when this same family of bacteria would earn a name history has never quite let go of. 3 separate promises, 3 separate destinations, And every single one of them starts right here tonight with these 46 quiet skeletons and one very confused researcher staring at a spreadsheet. But before any of that, there is a more basic question worth answering, one you might already be turning over in your own mind. How exactly does anyone read a diagnosis off of bones this old? We're talking about genetic material that spent over 5,000 years buried in frozen Siberian ground, not sitting safely in a hospital freezer somewhere. There is something almost unbelievable about the idea that scientists today can hold a fragment of a tooth smaller than a fingernail and tell you not just who a person was but what quietly killed them and roughly when it happened. That process is its own kind of remarkable story, and it deserves a proper telling because without it, none of what we just uncovered together tonight would exist at all. Let's actually answer that question honestly, because the real explanation is stranger, and in some ways more moving than most people expect. I think a lot of us grew up with a certain picture in our heads of how this works, probably thanks to a particular movie involving a mosquito, trapped in amber, and a very unfortunate theme park. Someone finds an old bone, a lab technician in a white coat pulls out something resembling a thick red liquid, and within an hour a full genetic portrait appears on a glowing screen. It makes for wonderful cinema. It has almost nothing to do with how any of this actually happens. Here is the truth, and I promise it is even more remarkable once you understand it properly. There is no blood left in a 5,000-year-old skeleton. No soft tissue, no neat sample waiting patiently to be drawn out with a syringe. What survives is something far smaller, far more fragile and hidden in places you would probably never think to look. And to be clear about something else that movie also got wrong, nobody in this field is trying to bring anything back to life. This is not resurrection. Nobody's attempting to grow a living, breathing version of an ancient plague bacterium in a petri dish somewhere. This is reading, not reviving, closer to translating a half-burned letter than reopening a sealed jar. The distinction matters because the actual goal here is understanding, not recreation. And honestly, that goal turns out to be far more useful and far less alarming than anything Hollywood ever imagined. The single best place on the entire human body to search for ancient genetic material is not the leg, not the ribs, not even the skull in general. It is one small, extremely dense bone tucked deep inside the ear called the petrous bone. If you have never heard that name before, you are far from alone. Most people go their entire lives without ever learning they're carrying one of the most protective structures in the human skeleton, sealed away almost like a tiny private vault. Think of it as the human body's own version of an airplane's black box, the one piece built tough enough to survive when almost everything around it has already been destroyed. That density is exactly why it matters here. It shields whatever genetic material is trapped inside from water from bacteria, from the thousands small chemical disasters that slowly erase everything else a body leaves behind. The inside of a tooth works surprisingly well too for very similar reasons, which is part of why so many of the discoveries in this story keep circling back to teeth. So picture what a research team is actually working with. Not a satisfying pool of preserved liquid, but a fragment of bone smaller than a fingernail drilled out with tools so precise they would look more at home in a jewelry workshop than a laboratory. Inside that fragment sit genetic strands that have spent 5,000 years slowly breaking apart into smaller and smaller pieces, degrading, fragmenting, becoming something closer to scattered confetti than an intact, readable sentence. Which raises a fair question. How do you read a sentence that has been torn into thousands of scattered scraps of confetti? The honest answer is you do not read it the way you would read a letter start to finish. You examine every single scrap individually, generate millions of tiny overlapping fragments through a process researchers call shotgun sequencing, and then hand the entire scattered mess over to a computer built specifically to reassemble it. Imagine tearing a 200-page novel into 1,000,000 tiny confetti pieces, then somehow reconstructing the whole story by matching torn edges and overlapping letters one microscopic piece at a time, until whole paragraphs start reappearing out of what looked like permanent chaos. No box lid with a finished picture to guide you, no shortcuts, just pure pattern matching, performed at a scale and speed no human eye could ever manage alone. That is roughly what is happening here, minus the satisfying crunch of actual paper. Once that digital reconstruction takes shape, it gets compared against a massive reference library built from modern organisms whose genetic makeup scientists already understand in detail, plague included. But a simple match is not enough on its own to make headlines. A careful team also checks for the specific genes tied to actual disease-causing behavior, the parts of the genetic code responsible for making a bacterium dangerous rather than harmless, precisely to rule out mistaking this particular organism for one of its milder everyday relatives that quietly survive in soil and water without ever hurting anyone. Only once those virulence markers show up clearly does a team feel confident putting their name behind a claim this serious. If enough of those reassembled fragments line up cleanly against the known genetic blueprint of a dangerous strain, that is your answer, sitting there in the data plane and undeniable. It is in every sense that matters a kind of digital autopsy, performed on someone who has been gone for over 5,000 years. Now here is where I want to slow down for a moment, because there is a detail in this process that I find almost unbearably clever, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. Ancient genetic material does not just sit there quietly waiting to be found. It actively falls apart in very specific, very predictable ways over time. The ends of the fragments develop a particular kind of chemical damage, a subtle rewriting of certain building blocks that only happens gradually over centuries, never within days or weeks. Researchers can actually check for this exact pattern of decay, almost like checking for a watermark hidden inside old paper currency. If a sample shows that telltale wear, it earns real credibility as something ancient. If a sample looks suspiciously fresh and clean with none of that expected damage, it raises an immediate red flag that something modern has slipped in and contaminated the result. And that threat of contamination is not some minor technical footnote. It might honestly be the single greatest danger in this entire field. Every person working in one of these laboratories carries their own genetic material on their skin, in their breath, in stray hair constantly. A careless cough near an open sample, a fingertip brushing the wrong surface, and an entire specimen can become hopelessly compromised, flooded with modern human genetic material that completely drowns out the faint ancient signal researchers are actually hunting for. This is exactly why serious laboratories built around this kind of ancient genetic work operate more like surgical wards than typical offices, full protective suits, positive air pressure keeping outside air from drifting in tools that get sterilized between every single use, sometimes entire buildings constructed specifically so that nobody who has ever handled a modern sample is allowed anywhere near the ancient one. It is slow. It is expensive, and it is the only way any of this holds up to real scrutiny. Here is something worth knowing too, since most people assume a discovery like this happens over the course of a single dramatic afternoon. It does not. From the moment a small bone fragment gets carefully drilled out of a skeleton, to the moment a finished peer-reviewed result reaches the public, you're usually looking at a process stretched across several years, not several days. Extraction, sequencing, cross-checking, rechecking, writing, waiting for other independent experts to try poking holes in the conclusion before it ever gets published. This field also carries some hard-earned scars from its earlier days back when a handful of exciting early claims about impossibly old genetic material turned out on closer inspection to be nothing more than modern contamination in disguise. Those early embarrassments are exactly why the rules got so strict and why nobody serious in this field takes a shortcut anymore. Nobody in this field gets to announce a discovery on the same afternoon they make it. That slow, unglamorous grind rarely makes it into the headline, but it is the entire reason the headline can be trusted at all. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment. If you found out that a single unplanned sneeze in the wrong lab could quietly undo years of careful, expensive research, would that make you trust these findings more or less? I will be honest, it makes me trust them more. Anyone willing to build that much caution into their process is not the kind of team chasing a headline. They are the kind of team trying very hard not to fool themselves. Now there is a second clock running through all of this work, separate from the genetic detective story we just walked through. And it is worth knowing the difference because people often confuse the two. Reconstructing what bacterium infected someone tells you what happened. It does not on its own tell you exactly when. For that, researchers lean on an entirely different kind of science, one many of us encountered briefly in a school science class, and mostly forgot: radiocarbon dating. Every living thing absorbs a very slightly radioactive form of carbon throughout its life, at a steady, predictable rate, and the moment that living thing dies, the clock starts running down at a fixed, well-understood pace. Measure how much of that particular carbon remains inside a bone today, and you can calculate with real precision roughly how long ago that individual stopped breathing. It is a completely different tool from the genetic detective work built on entirely different principles, resting on physics rather than biology. Think of it almost like two separate witnesses being questioned in two separate rooms with no way to compare notes beforehand. One witness, the genetic evidence, testifies to what infected this person. The other witness, the radiocarbon evidence, testifies to when this person lived and died. Neither one knows what the other said, and when both of them independently arrive at the same rough window of time, that agreement becomes powerful evidence in its own right, the kind no defense attorney could easily poke a hole through. Two unrelated clocks ticking down through completely different mechanisms arriving at the same conclusion. It also helps to understand why a site like this one tucked into southeastern Siberia turned out to preserve genetic material so unusually well in the first place. Cold climates slow almost everything down, including the chemical breakdown that normally destroys genetic material within a few thousand years in warmer regions. Soil temperature, moisture, even the mineral makeup of the ground itself, all play a role in whether a burial becomes a scientific treasure chest or comes back essentially empty-handed. That harsh, unforgiving Siberian cold, the very same cold Anya would have felt biting through her hide wrap, every winter turned out to be quietly working in this story's favour, 5,000 years later, acting almost like an accidental freezer that modern science would eventually learn to open. I think what moves me most about all of this is not even the technology itself. It is the sheer stubborn patience behind it. Somewhere out there, before any of this became routine laboratory work, there were scientists willing to spend years chasing genetic fragments that most of their colleagues assumed were simply too old, too degraded, too far gone to ever recover. One name worth knowing if you enjoy connecting dots like I do is a Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo. Early in his career, he was working quietly with Egyptian mummies, convinced there had to be some way to coax readable genetic information out of remains everyone else had already written off as scientifically useless. For years, a fair number of his peers treated that pursuit as closer to a hobby than a serious research path. He kept at it anyway, refining the methods, chasing down cleaner and cleaner extraction techniques, and decades later, That same stubborn persistence helped him guide the team that first sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal, a discovery so significant it eventually earned him a Nobel Prize. Every single technique we just walked through, the careful drilling, the contamination proofing the digital reassembly of shattered fragments, traces its lineage straight back to researchers like him, deciding against a fair amount of professional skepticism that the past was not as unreadable as everyone assumed. There is something almost poetic in that persistence, if you ask me. For most of human history, we accepted that once someone died, whatever secrets their body carried died along with them. Now, a fragment of bone, smaller than your smallest fingernail, can tell researchers what someone was infected with, roughly how old they were, sometimes even who their own grandparents were. It is quite literally reading a diary that survived a house fire, one charred, barely legible page at a time, and somehow still managing to piece together whole sentences. Quick question for you, and I am curious where people land on this one. Knowing everything we just walked through, does it change how you picture archaeology itself? A lot of us grew up imagining it as brushes and shovels and dusty museum shelves. These days, an awful lot of it happens on a computer screen sorting through millions of fragments of code that used to be a living person. And once you understand all of that, the findings from beside that Siberian lake stop feeling like a lucky guess and start feeling like something closer to a verdict. A verdict built from overlapping genetic fragments, reassembled by computer cross, checked against decay patterns. No contamination could fake confirmed independently by an entirely separate radioactive clock ticking away inside the bone itself. Every layer of that process pointing toward the exact same conclusion. These people this far back were carrying an ancestor of one of the deadliest organisms our species has ever encountered. And this exact toolkit, refined at sites like that one beside the lake, is the same toolkit that will keep resurfacing again and again as our story keeps moving forward tonight, carried to new bones, new burial grounds, new corners of the ancient world. Which brings us to a fair question, one I think deserves its own proper answer, rather than a rushed mention in passing. We have spent all this time talking about what this bacterium did, how it spread, how researchers found it buried in bone. But what actually is it? Not as a case number in a research paper, but as a living organism with its own strange biology, its own quiet history stretching back long before it ever met a single human being. Where did something this small and this simple come from in the first place, and how did it end up capable of doing what it did to that Siberian community, without even having some of the tools we usually associate with plague at all? That story deserves its own proper introduction, because the creature at the centre of everything we have covered tonight has a past every bit as strange as the graves it left behind. Every good mystery eventually has to introduce its main character properly. So let's finally pull back the curtain on this one, because up until now, we have only ever seen it from the outside through the damage it left behind. Its full name, if you want to get formal about it, is Yersinia pestis, a single bacterium invisible to the naked eye, shaped like a tiny rod, and responsible for more human death across recorded history than almost anything else our species has ever encountered, wars included. But before it earned that reputation, it had to be discovered, named, and argued over, and that story alone is worth a few minutes of your night. The year was 1894 in a crowded, frightened Hong Kong, in the middle of an outbreak that was killing people by the thousands. Two scientists working independently, and by most accounts not particularly fond of one another, raced to be the first to identify exactly what was causing it. One was a Japanese bacteriologist named Kitasato Shibasaburo, already famous, backed by a well-funded team, and given prime access to bodies and equipment by local authorities, eager to look decisive. The other was a Swiss-French researcher named Alexandre Yersin, working mostly alone out of a small straw hut near the hospital, because nobody would give him proper laboratory space, occasionally bribing sailors and morgue workers just to get access to a fresh body before it was buried. Kitasato announced his findings first, understandably given his head start. But in the rush to be first, his sample turned out to be contaminated, mixed together with an entirely different bacterium that had nothing to do with the outbreak at all. Yersin, working slower and with far fewer resources, took the extra time to isolate the organism cleanly and describe it correctly, and history eventually gave the bacterium his name rather than his rivals. There is something almost fitting about that, honestly. The thing that has spent thousands of years operating in the shadows finally got identified by the outsider, working alone in a hut rather than the well-funded team with all the institutional backing in the world. So what exactly did Yersin find once he finally got a proper look at it? A bacterium in the most basic sense is simply a single-celled organism, one of the oldest and most successful forms of life on this planet. Most bacteria are harmless, plenty are even helpful quietly doing useful work inside our own digestive systems every single day without anyone noticing. Yersinia pestis belongs to a category researchers call gram-negative, a label that comes from a 19th century staining test invented by a Danish scientist trying to tell different bacteria apart under a microscope. Soak a sample in a particular purple dye, rinse it, and some bacteria stubbornly hold onto the colour while others wash clean. The ones that wash clean our culprit included earned the label gram-negative, and it turns out that same structural quirk in their outer wall also happens to make them unusually good at slipping past a host's early defences undetected, which matters quite a lot in this story. A simple dye test from over a century ago, and it still tells researchers something useful about how this organism fights dirty. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people most once they actually hear it. This bacterium is astonishingly young. Not young in the sense of having just been discovered, but young in an evolutionary sense, barely a blink of an eye, compared to how long bacteria in general have existed on Earth. Its closest known relative is a much milder organism called Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, a bacterium that still exists today, usually causing nothing worse than a rough stomach bug, a few uncomfortable days of fever and cramping, before your body handles it and moves on with life. At some point, almost impossibly recently on a geological timescale, one branch of that fairly unremarkable gut bacterium picked up a handful of genetic changes and set off down an entirely different evolutionary path. What started as a forgettable stomach irritation slowly rebuilt itself piece by piece into one of the most efficient killers our species has ever documented. I find that origin story almost unsettling once it really sinks in. This was not some ancient ever-present menace lurking since the dawn of life on Earth, patiently waiting for humans to show up. Bacteria in general have existed on this planet for something like 3.5 billion years. Whatever transformed a forgettable stomach bug into a mass killer happened almost embarrassingly recently, by comparison well within the same rough stretch of time that our own species had already been painting on cave walls, burying its dead with flowers, and building the very first permanent settlements. This was not some ancient force of nature. It was closer to an accident, a minor forgettable organism that stumbled into a genetic shortcut and kept building on it. Now here is where the theatre metaphor actually earns its keep, because this particular performer does not have just one role. It has 3, and depending on how it enters a body, it plays a completely different part. The role most of us already picture thanks to centuries of paintings and woodcuts is the bubonic form. The bacterium settles into the lymph nodes closest to wherever it entered the body, usually near a bite or a small wound, and multiplies there, causing painful swollen lumps most often in the groin, the armpit or the neck. The word itself actually comes from an old Greek term for groin, since that was so often where the swelling first appeared. This is the classic image the one history books lean on constantly, the one that gave the entire disease its name. But there are two other roles this same organism can play, and honestly, they might be even more frightening precisely because they leave out the warning sign everybody has been trained to look for. The septicemic form skips the lymph nodes almost entirely and goes straight for the bloodstream, spreading rapidly through the entire body and sometimes causing tissue, especially at the fingers and toes, to darken and die from lack of circulation. Some historians actually believe this particular symptom more than anything else is where the phrase Black Death may have originally come from centuries later. And then there is the pneumonic form, which settles directly into the lungs, causing a violent, rapid illness that can kill within a couple of days, and which spreads from person to person simply through coughing. No insect required at all. No swollen bubo ever appearing to warn anyone what they are actually dealing with. 3 roles, 3 entirely different ways of ending a life. Same performer, different costume depending entirely on how it slips backstage into a human body in the first place. And this brings us to something worth correcting directly, because I think most of us are carrying around a slightly wrong picture in our heads. Ask almost anyone what plague needs to spread, and you will hear the same answer, almost automatically rats and fleas. That association is not wrong exactly. It just is not the whole story, and it is definitely not where this particular story of ours begins. For a flea to carry this bacterium from one host to another, the way we picture in every dramatic medieval illustration, the bacterium actually needs a very specific genetic tool, one that lets it survive and multiply inside a flea's digestive tract. Once it establishes itself there, it forms a kind of sticky internal clump that physically blocks the flea's gut, leaving the poor insect constantly hungry, no matter how much it feeds, and increasingly desperate to bite anything nearby, over and over regurgitating infected blood back into each new wound in the process. It is in a strange way a brutally elegant piece of biological engineering, turning the insect's own hunger into a delivery mechanism. Researchers refer to the gene responsible for that particular trick using the shorthand letters YMT. Without it, a flea's own digestive system simply breaks the bacterium down like any other meal, and transmission through biting insects effectively stops working. Here is the detail that should make the hair on your arm stand up a little. The strain we have been following tonight, the one buried beside that Siberian lake, did not have that gene. Not yet. Whatever devastated those families was doing it without any help from fleas at all, which raises an obvious question, one worth sitting with for a moment before I answer it. If it could not ride inside a flea, how was it killing people at all? The bacterium was not defenseless, even in this earlier, cruder version of itself. It still carried a different genetic tool, one that let it produce a particular protein capable of breaking down the natural barriers inside human tissue that would otherwise help keep an infection contained in one place. Think of those barriers almost like fences meant to keep a small brush fire from spreading into the surrounding forest. This particular tool let the bacterium quietly cut through the fences, allowing the infection to spread aggressively through the bloodstream once it got even the smallest foothold. That single tool alone was apparently more than enough. It simply needed a different door into the body than the one it would eventually specialize in using thousands of years later. Direct contact with an infected animal's blood or organs during hunting or butchering could open that door. So could something as ordinary and human as a parent leaning close over a sick child's bed for several nights in a row, breathing the same air again and again. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I would honestly love to hear your answer in the comments. Before tonight, if someone had asked you whether plague could exist entirely without rats or fleas being involved at all, would you have believed them? There is something almost humbling in learning that history's most notorious epidemic villain spent thousands of years auditioning for the role before it finally got its signature weapon: evolution. It turns out does not work, like a screenwriter handing a character their full arsenal in the opening scene. It works more like a slow, patient understudy, picking up one new skill at a time, sometimes, over thousands of years long, before anyone in the audience even realizes a performance is underway at all. And if you want one more detail to sit with before we move on, consider this. The very gene that eventually let this bacterium ride inside fleas did not simply appear out of nowhere either. Researchers believe it was very likely picked up from another unrelated bacterium entirely through a strange, almost unsettling process, where small loops of genetic material can occasionally pass sideways between completely different species, almost like a USB drive being handed from one stranger to another, rather than only passing down from parent to offspring the way we usually picture inheritance working. Nature apparently is not above a little theft when it serves a purpose. We're going to come back to exactly how and when that particular theft happened later tonight, because it marks one of the true turning points in this whole story. But for now, it is enough to know the tool did not exist yet in the version we have been following. Can I share something that has stuck with me since I first learned all of this? We like origin stories with a clean, dramatic turning point, a single lightning strike that changes everything at once. Real biology rarely works that way. This particular transformation took what were likely thousands of years of small, unglamorous trial and error dead ends, half-measures, tools picked up and refined and occasionally borrowed from somewhere else entirely. History's most feared epidemic did not arrive fully formed. It assembled itself slowly, one quiet improvement at a time, largely unnoticed, until one day it very much was not. It also helps to put this bacterium's age in perspective against some of its more established rivals. Tuberculosis, for comparison, is believed to have been quietly infecting our ancestors for tens of thousands of years, patiently co-evolving alongside us the entire time. Malaria has been shaping human genetics for longer still. Next to those two, Yersinia pestis is practically an intern arriving late to a very old and very crowded profession, and somehow still managing to out-terrify almost everyone else in the field within a fraction of the time. Here's one more question worth sitting with, if you do not mind me asking two tonight instead of one. Knowing that this organism was still in a sense unfinished when it swept through that family beside the lake, does it change how you think about the outbreak we walked through earlier? Somehow an unfinished, half-built version of this disease was already enough to nearly erase an entire generation of children. So here is where that leaves us. A bacterium barely out of its evolutionary infancy, already lethal in three completely different ways, already capable of tearing through a small hunting camp on the shore of a Siberian lake, and it had not even picked up its most famous weapon yet. Everything we witnessed happened to Anya's family, the fever, the ragged breathing, the blood in that first terrible cough, lines up precisely with an organism still relying on direct contact and close human breath, rather than the flea-driven cycle that would eventually define the disease's reputation centuries later. No swollen buboes waiting to warn anyone, no obvious insect bite to point a finger at, just an invisible half-finished killer moving quietly from one loved one to the next, which leaves one particularly important question hanging over the rest of tonight's story. If this early version of the organism was already devastating enough to nearly erase a generation of children beside one quiet lake, using nothing more sophisticated than direct contact and close breath, what happens once it finally gets that missing piece? What happens when this same performer, already dangerous even in its rawest, least polished form, finally learns to travel efficiently, riding quietly in something as small as a single flea, carried across entire continents, by people who have no idea what they're bringing with them. To answer that properly, we need to go back to that lake one final time because there is still a piece of that very first outbreak we have not looked at closely enough. A detail buried inside the bacterium's own genetic code that quietly rewrites what scientists thought they understood about how dangerous a disease needs an entire city to become. It turns out this early unfinished performer was already carrying a fuller arsenal than anyone expected, and figuring out exactly what that arsenal contained changed how researchers think about outbreaks like this one for good. Here is the detail I promised, and I think it might be the most quietly unsettling fact in this entire story so far. So let's sit with it properly instead of rushing past it. For years, most researchers studying these early strains of plague operated on a comfortable, almost tidy assumption. If a strain was missing, the genetic tool needed to travel through fleas, surely it must have been missing other things too. A weaker half-built version of the disease, dangerous in theory, but nowhere near as lethal as the fully weaponized strains that would show up thousands of years later. It made a kind of intuitive sense. Evolution builds things up gradually, so an earlier version should logically be a lesser version right along every dimension. At once, the way an early prototype of any invention tends to be clumsier and less capable than the polished final model. The bacterium buried beside that Siberian lake did not get that memo. When researchers reconstructed its full genetic profile, they found something that quietly overturned that comfortable assumption. This strain was already carrying essentially the complete toolkit needed to overwhelm a human immune system to spread aggressively once inside a body, to shut down organs and flood a bloodstream with exactly the kind of damage that makes plague so notoriously fast and so notoriously fatal. The only piece missing was the one specific upgrade required for efficient travel between hosts through a flea's bite. Everything else, the actual killing power, was already fully formed. Can I be honest about why that distinction matters so much? Most of us tend to lump virulence and transmissibility together in our heads, as if a disease is simply more or less dangerous, one single sliding scale from mild to deadly. But those are actually two completely separate properties. Virulence is how much damage an organism does once it gets inside you. Transmissibility is how efficiently it manages to get from one person to the next in the first place. A pathogen can be extraordinarily good at one and still be working on the other, almost like a criminal who has already mastered every part of the job except the getaway car. This particular bacterium, it turns out, mastered the first skill long before it ever picked up the second. It was not a weak early prototype slowly building toward danger. It was already the finished lethal product, just missing its most efficient delivery system. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Which sounds scarier to you, honestly? A disease that starts mild and slowly builds toward deadly, or one that starts every bit as deadly as it will ever be, and only later works out how to spread further? I know which one keeps me up a little longer once the lights are off. There is another layer of honesty worth including here too, because good storytelling and good science both require admitting what we still do not know. The researchers behind this discovery were careful not to claim certainty about exactly which animal first handed this bacterium to that Siberian community. Marmots remain the strongest, most likely suspect given how deeply woven they were into daily life along that shoreline. But at least one researcher on the project has openly wondered whether some other creature, entirely even something as ordinary as a bird passing through the area, might have played a role somewhere along that original chain of transmission. It is a strange thought, honestly, picturing something as unassuming as a passing bird carrying the opening move of a 5,000-year story it would never know it started. Nobody's pretending to have the complete picture here, and I find that admission more convincing than false certainty ever could be. Real science tends to sound a little more like, here is our best current explanation, and a little less like, we have solved this completely forever end of story. If a video ever tells you archaeology has everything figured out, with zero loose threads left dangling, that is usually your cue to be a little suspicious. Even with that honest uncertainty sitting in the background, the marmot itself deserves a proper introduction, because it is not just some incidental detail in this story. It has quietly shaped human history around that region for thousands of years, in ways most people outside of Siberia and Mongolia have simply never had a reason to learn about. The Siberian marmot, sometimes called the tarbagan by people native to the region, is a large, thickly built, burrowing rodent closer in size to a well-fed house cat than to the mice most of us picture when we hear the word rodent. These animals live in tight colonial burrow systems, entire extended families crowded together underground through the brutal Siberian winter, sharing warmth, sharing space, and as it turns out, sharing whatever pathogens happen to be circulating among them. Some of these burrow systems run remarkably deep, well below the frost line, allowing entire family groups to sleep through 7 or 8 months of hibernation, packed close together in the dark, waking each spring into the exact same social circle they entered winter with. That close constant contact between animals living almost on top of each other for months at a time makes a marmot colony an unusually efficient place for a disease like this one to establish itself and persist quietly. Generation after generation, long after any single outbreak among the local human population has burned itself out. For a hunting people who depended on that animal for meat, for fur warm enough to survive a Siberian winter, and for those small polished teeth we already talked about, the marmot was not a danger to be avoided. It was survival itself, which meant that every single hunt carried a quiet, invisible wager buried inside it, one nobody at the time had any way of recognizing. And here is where this story does something I honestly was not expecting when I first started researching tonight's episode. That exact same wager marmot fur against invisible danger did not stay buried in prehistory. It came roaring back into the historical record barely a little more than a century ago, and it is worth telling properly because it shows just how little this particular threat has actually changed across 5,000 years. In the autumn of 1910, in a stretch of northeastern China commonly known as Manchuria, a new fashion trend collided head-first with an ancient danger. German chemists had recently developed dye techniques capable of transforming cheap, coarse marmot fur into a convincing imitation of expensive sable and mink. There is something almost darkly funny about that detail if you allow yourself to sit with it for a second. A fashion industry innovation dreamed up in a European chemistry lab with absolutely no awareness of Siberian ecology ended up quietly loading a gun that a completely different continent would eventually pull the trigger on. Suddenly, marmot pelts were worth real money on international fashion markets, and thousands of migrant hunters flooded into marmot territory along the open grasslands, many of them with little to no experience handling these animals safely. Traditional local hunters had long known through generations of hard-earned caution to avoid any marmot that looked sick or moved strangely, to leave a slow, easily caught animal exactly where they found it. The new arrivals, chasing profit rather than following inherited caution, did not know or simply did not care to avoid the same warning signs. A slow marmot, after all, is a marmot that is far easier to catch. By October, cases of a violent, fast-moving respiratory illness began appearing among the hunters and traders working the fur trade routes. It spread along the newly built railway lines connecting the region to major cities, moving as fast as the trains themselves could carry it city to city in a matter of days rather than the seasons it would have taken on foot. Within months it had reached crowded urban centres, tearing through Harbin, reaching all the way to cities nearly 2,000 miles from where the very first case had been recorded. The disease killed with almost total certainty once symptoms appeared, and by the time the outbreak finally burned out the following spring, it had taken more than 60,000 lives. I want you to notice something about that description because I think it deserves a moment of proper recognition. No swollen buboes announcing themselves early enough to warn anyone. Rapid spread through crowded human populations along transportation routes. An origin traced directly back to close contact with an infected marmot. That is not some distant historical curiosity happening in a completely different disease. That is functionally almost precisely the same pattern we walk through together beside that Siberian lake, 5,000 years earlier, just wearing an early 20th century costume riding railways instead of footpaths. And that difference in transportation is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains almost the entire gap in scale between the two stories. Anya's outbreak, devastating as it was, stayed contained to a handful of related families along one shoreline, spreading only as fast as a person could walk or a canoe could travel across open water. It had nowhere else to go. 1910's outbreak had railways purpose-built to move people and goods across vast distances in days rather than seasons, and the bacterium, ever the opportunist, simply climbed aboard along with everyone else. Same organism, same essential lethal core, same rough transmission pattern, and yet one event claimed a small handful of children in one summer, while the other claimed 60,000 lives across an entire region in a matter of months. The disease itself had not fundamentally changed. The infrastructure surrounding it had, and that alone was enough to turn a tragedy into a catastrophe. What finally stopped it says something remarkable about how far human understanding had come in those 5,000 years, even if the underlying threat itself had barely changed at all. A Cambridge-trained physician named Wu Liante was placed in charge of the response, and rather than relying on guesswork or superstition, he insisted on rigorous quarantine, careful tracking of contacts, and mass cremation of the dead to interrupt further spread. That last decision, mass cremation, faced real, understandable resistance at the time, cutting directly against centuries of tradition and deeply held belief about how the dead deserved to be treated. He pushed it through anyway, convinced correctly, as it turned out that breaking the chain of infection had to come first. He also pushed for something that sounds almost painfully familiar to anyone who lived through recent years: face covering specifically designed layered cloth masks for medical workers and the general public. Among the very first organized use of that kind of protective equipment anywhere in the world. Slowly, methodically, the outbreak was brought under control by spring, and it left behind something more lasting than just a death toll. Many of the quarantine and contact tracing principles developed during those difficult winter months went on to shape how the entire field of modern epidemiology approaches an outbreak, methods that public health officials somewhere in the world were still leaning on in some form barely a handful of years ago, during a very different pandemic that most of us lived through personally. The specific villain changes from century to century. A surprising amount of the playbook for fighting it does not. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, and I would love to hear where you land on it. Anya's people had no way of understanding what was moving through their camp, no tools beyond grief and instinct and quiet desperation. A little over a century ago, facing essentially the same threat from essentially the same animal, humanity finally had the tools to fight back and win. What does it say about us that it took 5,000 years to get from one of those moments to the other? I think about that gap more than I probably should. The marmot never changed. The bacterium in its essential lethal core had barely changed either, still carrying that same fully formed killing power we talked about a few minutes ago. The only thing that actually evolved across those 5,000 years was us. our understanding, our tools, our willingness to look a familiar old danger directly in the face, instead of simply burying our children and hoping it would not come back. And there is something almost bittersweet in realizing that because it means every single person we have met so far tonight, Anya, her children, the healer who tried everything she knew and still lost, did nothing wrong. They were not careless. They were not foolish. They were simply born several thousand years before the tools that could have saved them even existed. That is honestly one of the harder truths buried inside a story like this one. One more question before we move forward, and this one has honestly followed me around since I first put these two events side by side. If Anya's community had somehow been handed just one piece of what Wulin Tasyu, even something as simple as separating the sick from the healthy, a little sooner, do you think that one terrible summer beside the lake might have unfolded differently? I go back and forth on my own answer, more than I would like to admit. Some outbreaks, even with perfect knowledge, are simply too fast, too quiet in their early stages to fully outrun. But I like to believe at least a few of those children might have made it. Maybe that is just me wanting to give Anya's story a kinder ending than the one the bones actually recorded. What I keep coming back to more than anything else is how thin the line really is between a quiet family tragedy and a headline that reaches 60,000 deaths. Not the bacterium, not even the animal carrying it, just distance, density and speed, three ordinary, unglamorous factors that happen to be almost completely absent beside that Siberian lake and almost completely present 100 years ago along a Manchurian railway line. But Lake Baikal was never the only frozen shoreline holding on to a secret like this. Long before anyone thought to look on this side of the world, another lone grave a world away from Siberia, tucked into a much colder stretch of northern Europe, had already quietly rewritten what scientists believed was the oldest chapter of this story. For years this next case was the record holder, the earliest confirmed appearance of this bacterium anywhere on the planet, until the discoveries we just spent all this time walking through finally pushed it into second place. It centers on a single man buried alone rather than among family carrying evidence that would eventually connect all the way back to everything we have just walked through together tonight, and honestly his story might be even lonelier than Anya's. Let's cross an entire continent to get there, because the next piece of this puzzle was not sitting in Siberia at all. It was waiting on the northern edge of Europe in a place most people outside of archaeology have never once heard of. The site is called Rinakalns, a quiet stretch of land in modern Latvia, close to a slow-moving river, feeding into a lake in the northern part of the country. For thousands of years, a community of hunter-gatherers returned to this exact spot again and again, not to bury their dead in any grand or formal way, but simply to live, eat and discard whatever they no longer needed. Over centuries that accumulated debris shells, broken tools, cracked animal bones, built up into what archaeologists call a meaden, essentially an ancient trash heap, except one that happened to become an extraordinary time capsule almost entirely by accident. Picture layer after layer building up over so many generations that the ground itself eventually rose into a small distinct hill, a shape entirely built out of what one community decided it no longer needed. 19th century researchers digging into it for the very first time had no idea they were standing on top of what would eventually become one of the most important single graves in this entire field of study. Here's a small, quietly funny detail worth pausing on before we go further. Shellfish leave behind an awful lot of calcium carbonate once you've eaten your way through enough of them, and that particular mineral happens to do something remarkable to the soil around it. It keeps things from turning acidic, and acidic soil is usually exactly what destroys bone over the centuries, which means in a strange twist most of us would never guess. The ordinary trash heap our ancestors casually discarded turned out to preserve human remains better than plenty of far more careful, far more formal burials from the very same era. Sometimes the humble garbage pile outperforms the grand tomb. There is a lesson in there somewhere, even if I am still working out exactly what it is. Somewhere inside that shell-midden researchers eventually recovered the remains of an adult man, one they would later label simply RV2039 in their notes. No name survives, obviously, so let's give him one for tonight the way we did earlier with Anya. Let's call him Ansis. And here is where his story immediately takes a different emotional shape than the one we spent the first part of tonight walking through. Ansis was not buried among a cluster of children, not laid to rest beside family members who died in the very same terrible stretch of days. He was alone, a single grave tucked into that accumulated shell, and refuse with no obvious sign that anyone else around him had been sick at the exact same time. That detail matters more than it might first appear. Was Ansis simply unlucky? One isolated case of a rare and terrible infection that never spread any further than his own body, or did he belong to a larger, quieter tragedy that time and decay have simply erased, leaving him as the only survivor of the archaeological record? If you can even call someone in a grave a survivor of anything, nobody can say for certain. And I think that particular uncertainty is almost more haunting than a fully explained outbreak would be. At least beside that Siberian lake, we could reconstruct a full, if devastating, picture. Here we're left with a single man and a very large, very quiet question mark. Now here is where this story takes a distinctly different scientific turn, one worth understanding properly, because we have not covered this particular method yet tonight. Earlier, we spent a good amount of time on how researchers pull genetic material out of ancient bone. That approach worked here too, to a degree. But the team studying Ansis wanted a second completely independent form of proof before they were willing to put their names behind a claim this significant, and this time they turned to something other than genetic material entirely. They went looking for proteins. Proteins are, in a sense, the workers a cell actually sends out to do its job, built according to instructions carried in genetic code, but physically distinct from that code itself. Think of it almost like the difference between finding someone's original handwritten recipe card, which is what genetic material is closer to, versus actually finding crumbs of the finished dish still sitting on a plate somewhere. Both point toward the exact same meal having been made. They're just built out of entirely different kinds of evidence, surviving through entirely different chemical pathways over time. And it turns out certain proteins can survive in ancient remains through pathways slightly different from how genetic material breaks down, sometimes holding on a little longer, sometimes surviving in situations where genetic material has already degraded past the point of reliable reading. Inside Ansis's remains, researchers identified 3 separate proteins specific to this exact bacterium, distinct molecular fingerprints that simply do not show up unless this particular organism was actually present in his body. Genetic evidence pointing one direction, protein evidence confirming the very same conclusion through a completely different scientific pathway. 2 independent witnesses, if you remember that comparison from earlier tonight, except this time one of them was not even genetic material at all. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Does it surprise you that scientists can pull this many independent cross-checking types of evidence out of a single unnamed grave from thousands of years ago? It still catches me off guard a little every time I sit with it properly. And once that diagnosis was confirmed, the researchers did something else, something that turned this lonely grave into one of the most important single data points in this entire field. They placed Ansis's strain onto the full family tree of every known version of this bacterium, ancient and modern combined, and found that his particular branch sat closer to the very root of that tree than anything else ever discovered. not simply old. Structurally basic, foundational, sitting nearer to the actual starting point of this bacterium's entire existence than any other sample scientist had ever managed to recover. For a while, that made Ansys's case the oldest confirmed appearance of this organism anywhere on the planet, the deepest route anyone had ever traced this family tree back to. It held that record for years. And then, as we already know from earlier tonight, the discoveries beside that Siberian lake eventually pushed even further back, complicating the picture all over again. Which tells you something important about how this entire field actually works. Nobody gets to plant a flag and call a question permanently settled. Every single answer here is really just the best current answer, always sitting one lucky excavation away from being revised. But here is the detail about Ansys that I find almost unbearably poignant more than the record keeping itself. His particular branch of the family tree, as far as researchers can tell, simply ended. It never continued forward into anything else. None of the later strains we've talked about tonight, not the ones that swept along the steppe, not the ones that would eventually reach medieval Europe centuries later, traced their ancestry back through him. Whatever chain of infection Ansys was part of, however it started, it appears to have gone extinct along with him, or not long after. A genuine dead end in the evolutionary story, a road this particular organism tried, and then for reasons we will probably never fully know, simply stopped travelling down. There is something quietly moving about that if you let yourself sit with it. We tend to imagine history as one long connected chain, everything leading somewhere, everything mattering to what comes after it. But evolution does not actually work that way, and neither honestly does history. Most branches simply end. Most stories do not get a sequel. Ansys existed, he suffered through something we can now name with real scientific confidence thousands of years later, and then that particular thread of the story simply stopped quietly, without ever connecting to anything that came after. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment longer than we usually allow ourselves to. So much of how we tell history, and honestly so much of how we tell our own lives, leans on the comforting idea that everything is building towards something, that every struggle eventually pays off in some larger connected story. Ansys is a quiet, patient reminder that this was never actually a guarantee. Sometimes a life is simply a life complete and meaningful, entirely on its own terms, whether or not it ever connects to anything larger that comes afterward. Ansys was not entirely alone in that region either, even if his own grave was solitary. Not far from where he lived, and only slightly later in time, researchers found evidence of the very same bacterium inside the remains of a farmer in Sweden, carrying yet another distinct branch of the family tree unrelated to his. And beyond that single case, additional early traces have turned up scattered across Estonia and Lithuania, as well an unusual cluster of very old evidence gathering along this one particular stretch of northern Europe, which raises a truly strange question worth sitting with. Why here? Why would multiple separate, apparently unconnected branches of this same young, still evolving bacterium all show up clustering around roughly the same corner of the world within a similar general window of time, a world away from the Siberian and Central Asian origins we spent most of tonight exploring? Nobody has a fully satisfying answer to that yet, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, just to wrap this section up neatly. It might mean the bacterium was already travelling far wider, far earlier than anyone previously assumed, carried along trade routes and migration paths we still do not fully understand. And that possibility is not quite as far-fetched as it might sound at first. This exact stretch of the Baltic coastline was already, even at this early date, sitting at the centre of a genuine trade network, one built around a very different kind of treasure, entirely amber, that warm golden fossilised resin that people across ancient Europe prized enough to carry hundreds of miles from where it washed up on these northern shores. If small precious objects like that were already moving along established routes stretching deep into the rest of the continent, it is not unreasonable to wonder whether people, and whatever they happened to be carrying inside their own bodies at the time, might have been moving along some of those same paths as well. It might also simply mean similar zoonotic spillover events were happening independently in multiple places, because the underlying conditions close contact between small human communities and the wild animals around them were common across an enormous stretch of the ancient world. Both explanations are still on the table, and honestly both of them are a little unsettling in their own way. Speaking of that underlying condition, it is worth asking what Ansis himself might have been doing when whatever infected him actually crossed over. The archaeological record at that particular midden gives us a real clue here, and it points toward an animal we have not talked about yet tonight at all, the beaver. Among the discarded animal remains found at that site, beaver bones appear more often than almost anything else, suggesting these hunter-gatherers relied heavily on that particular animal for meat, and fur trapping it, skinning it, handling its blood and organs directly with their bare hands on a regular basis. Notice what that means for the bigger picture we've been building all night. In Siberia, the likely culprit was a marmot. Here, on the opposite side of a continent, it may well have been a beaver. Two completely different animals, two completely different ecosystems separated by thousands of miles. And yet the underlying pattern is almost identical. A small hunting community deeply dependent on one particular wild animal for survival, unknowingly opening a door that would occasionally let something far more dangerous walk through alongside the meat and fur they actually came for. The specific animal keeps changing depending on where you look. The basic quiet human vulnerability underneath it does not. I keep coming back to how ordinary all of this actually was at the time. Nobody beside that Baltic shoreline thought of trapping beavers as a dangerous act. It was simply Tuesday. It was simply how you fed your family and kept warm through another hard northern winter. And every single Tuesday like that one carried a small, silent, completely invisible risk that nobody alive at the time had any conceivable way of measuring. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, and I would love to know your honest answer. If you learned that some perfectly ordinary part of your own daily routine carried a small hidden risk you could never actually see or measure, would you honestly want to know about it? Or would you rather stay in blissful ignorance the way Ansis and his community necessarily had to? We are never going to know Ansis's whole story. We do not know if he had a family somewhere nearby wondering where he had gone. We do not know if he simply wandered off sick away from the people he loved the way some animals instinctively do when they sense death coming. We do not know if his community even understood he was gone or grieved him properly, or simply assumed he had met his end out on the land the way so many hunters eventually did. All we have is a shell midden 3 ancient proteins and a lonely branch on a family tree that quietly stopped growing thousands of years ago. And maybe that is exactly why his story has stayed with me the way it has more than I expected it to when I first started putting tonight's episode together. Anya's story is a story about a community, about shared grief, about people leaning on each other through something none of them understood. Ansis's story is a story about being one single small data point in a pattern far too large for any one grave to explain on its own. A man whose entire existence, as far as science can currently tell, survived only because of an accident of preservation and a few stubborn proteins that refused to fully disappear. But his story, brief and solitary as it was, connects directly to something much larger, happening across that same stretch of northern Europe, during roughly that same window of time, something that did not stay contained to a single grave. Not far from where Ansis lived and died, an entire farming community would eventually go silent too all at once. And for decades afterward, historians assumed they simply knew exactly why. Picture something completely different from anything we've walked through so far tonight, because the people we're about to meet did not bury their dead quietly in a shell midden or a quiet shoreline plot. They built monuments, scattered across a region of southern Sweden called Falbygden, and a scattering of nearby coastal sites. A farming people raised structures out of massive slabs of stone, tall enough to walk into, sturdy enough that a fair number of them are still standing today, thousands of years later. Archaeologists call them passage graves, long stone corridors leading into a central chamber, built specifically to be reopened again and again, generation after generation, as new family members died and were carried inside to join everyone who came before them. Some of these chambers held the remains of dozens of individuals by the time they finally stopped being used. Bones shifted and rearranged over centuries as space ran short. Older remains pushed gently aside to make room for whoever came next. These were not single private burials. They were in a very real sense family homes for the dead, reused patiently across centuries, standing in open Swedish fields to this day. Quiet enough that a person could walk past one without ever guessing what 6 generations of secrets it was still quietly holding on to. For a long time, the story historians told about what eventually happened to the people who built these tombs was almost disappointingly simple. Around 5,000 years ago, farming communities across large parts of northern Europe went into a sharp, unmistakable decline, their numbers dropping fast enough that archaeologists gave the whole event its own name, the Neolithic decline. And for decades, the leading explanation stayed comfortably practical. Bad harvests, exhausted soil, a changing climate making an already difficult way of life even harder. It made sense on paper. Farming is fragile, and a run of poor seasons can crumble a fragile system quickly, the same way a single bad quarter can sink a business that looked perfectly stable the year before. There is nothing unreasonable about that explanation, to be fair. Early farming really was a precarious way to live, entirely dependent on rainfall and soil, and a dozen small variables nobody back then had any way of controlling. But an explanation being reasonable is not the same thing as an explanation being complete, and for a long time nobody had the tools to check whether something else might have been quietly happening underneath the more visible agricultural story. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. Does that explanation sound familiar to you? The tidy, practical one that feels obviously true, right up until somebody actually goes looking for proof. Because I have noticed something about this entire story tonight. Almost every single time we've encountered the comfortable common sense explanation for one of these ancient collapses, it has turned out to be only part of the picture, sometimes barely any of it at all. I'm starting to wonder if that pattern itself is the real lesson hiding underneath tonight's whole story, more than any single outbreak we've covered so far. Researchers eventually pulled genetic material from the remains of 108 people, buried across 8 of these passage graves, along with 1 additional burial from a stone-lined grave in nearby Denmark. What they found inside these ancient bones quietly rewrote the entire conversation around this collapse. At least 17 out of every 100 individuals tested carried clear evidence of the very same bacterium we've been tracing all night, scattered across sites separated by real distance, not clustered in one single unlucky location. But the truly remarkable part was not simply that the bacterium was present. It was how the researchers were able to trace its exact path once they mapped out who these people actually were in relation to one another. Using the same kind of kinship reconstruction we talked about earlier tonight beside that Siberian lake, they discovered these individuals belonged to one extended family line stretching across 6 full generations. And within that single family's history, they could identify at least 3 distinct waves of infection spread out across roughly 120 years. Not one outbreak. 3 arriving in slow staggered succession, each one striking the very same bloodline that had somehow impossibly kept surviving and rebuilding after the last one. I want to sit with that phrase for a second because I think it deserves more weight than a quick mention. The same family, 3 separate times, across 120 years. That is not a single tragic summer the way we witnessed beside that Siberian lake earlier tonight. That is something closer to a curse that kept finding its way back to the same front door generation after generation, just when the family had likely started to believe the worst was finally behind them. This finding also settled an argument that has been quietly simmering in this particular corner of science for years. A number of researchers had long assumed that this early pre-flea version of the bacterium simply was not capable of causing anything resembling a true community-wide epidemic, that it could infect an unlucky individual here and there, but never truly take hold and spread through an entire population the way later, more evolved strains eventually would. This new evidence, pulled from 6 generations of one Swedish family, directly challenged that assumption. Whatever this bacterium was doing here, it was not behaving like some occasional bad luck event politely knocking on one door at a time. It was returning again and again at a scale that made the old, more comfortable assumption very difficult to keep defending. There was one more organism riding along in some of these remains, a small detail worth including, because it adds real texture to just how much these communities were quietly dealing with all at once. A handful of individuals in this same study also carried evidence of a completely different disease entirely, one spread by lice, rather than fleas or direct contact, a relapsing fever that would have brought its own waves of exhausting recurring illness. Plague was not the only invisible threat moving through these tombs and the households connected to them. It was simply the one that happened to leave the clearest, most traceable fingerprint behind. Here's a detail from this same research that has stuck with me more than almost anything else we have covered tonight. Looking closely at how these particular families were structured inside their tombs, researchers noticed something quietly striking about who ended up buried where. The men in each tomb tended to be closely related to one another, brothers, fathers, sons, staying rooted to the same land and the same ancestral resting place their whole lives. The women, by contrast, generally had no genetic relatives buried alongside them in that same tomb at all. They had come from somewhere else, married in from other communities, and eventually been laid to rest among people who were biologically speaking complete strangers to them. And yet researchers could still trace some of these women back to brothers and family members buried in entirely separate tombs, sometimes only a short distance away, showing that these communities kept careful track of who belonged to whom, even across households, even across village lines, in a world with absolutely no written records to help them remember. Can I be honest about how much that detail moved me? Somewhere in that family structure is a young woman leaving the only home she had ever known to go live among strangers, carrying whatever hopes a person carries into a new life like that, with no way of knowing her new family's tomb was already unknowingly sitting on top of a pattern that would keep repeating for the next 120 years. It is such an ordinary, universal kind of transition, leaving home to build a life somewhere new, and yet here it sits quietly recorded in bone thousands of years later, tangled up with one of the deadliest organisms our species has ever encountered. She almost certainly never knew the two things were connected. We only know now because her own skeleton and the careful genetic threads connecting it to brothers buried miles away refuse to fully disappear. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, and I would honestly love to hear your take on this one. If you found out your own family line had quietly survived something like this 3 separate times across 6 generations, and you were only now learning about it, thousands of years later would you want to know? Or is there a kind of mercy in a family simply not knowing how many close calls came before them? There is one more finding from this research that I think deserves real weight before we move on, because it is quietly one of the more unsettling details in the entire study. As the researchers pieced together the pattern across those 3 waves, they noticed that the first 2 outbreaks stayed relatively small and contained a handful of deaths here and there, families grieving and continuing on. The 3rd wave was different, wider, more aggressive, and one of the researchers leading the project offered an observation about that final wave that I have not been able to shake since I first came across it. It is possible he suggested that what survives in the archaeological record from that last outbreak is only the very beginning of it, the first handful of deaths that still had people healthy enough left to bury them properly. After that point, there may simply have been nobody left standing to carry the next body into the tomb. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. We have been measuring this entire story tonight by what we can find, by which graves survived, by which bones still held on to enough evidence for modern science to read. But what if the most devastating chapter of this particular outbreak is not sitting in that tomb at all, precisely because there was nobody left healthy enough to put anyone else inside it? Sometimes, the most important part of a story is not what got recorded. It is the silence sitting right where the ending should have been. I think about that idea more broadly than just this one Swedish family, honestly. Archaeology and history in general tends to reward whatever left something behind. A grave, a monument, a written record. But the very worst moments in a community's life are often exactly the moments least likely to leave a tidy trace, because the people who would normally do the recording, the burying, the remembering, are themselves the ones who did not survive to do it. Which means every single outbreak, every collapse, every quiet tragedy we have walked through together tonight is very possibly an undercount, a softened version of something that in its very worst days had nobody left standing to write it down properly at all. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Does that change how you think about the archaeological record in general, knowing that its very worst chapters might be the ones least likely to have survived clearly enough for us to read them? That same final strain, according to the researchers who studied it, also appeared to be carrying a version of this bacterium capable of spreading more widely than anything seen in the earlier waves, edging closer generation by generation toward whatever this organism was slowly becoming on its long road toward the pandemic, potential it would eventually reach. It is worth pausing on how strange that timeline actually is. 2 smaller outbreaks decades apart, almost like the bacterium was quietly rehearsing, adjusting, testing. Which version of itself could survive best inside a farming community like this one, before finally arriving at a 3rd performance, dangerous enough that researchers now suspect it may have carried real epidemic potential, spreading further and faster than either of the versions that came before it. We're not quite ready yet tonight to open up exactly what changed inside it to make that leap possible. That piece of the story is still waiting for us, a little further down the road. But it is worth remembering this particular Swedish family the next time we get there, because they may have been standing closer to that turning point than almost anyone else we've met so far. What strikes me most about this entire chapter, more than the outbreak itself, is the contrast sitting quietly underneath it. These were people who built permanent monumental structures meant to outlast them by thousands of years, stone corridors solid enough that some of them are still standing in a Swedish field today, visitable, photographable, almost impossibly intact. And yet the actual society that built them, the living, breathing web of families and neighbours and shared meals, turned out to be nowhere near as durable as the stone they left behind. The tombs survived. The civilization that filled them did not, at least not in the form its builders would have recognized. I think there is something worth sitting with in that gap between what we build to last and what actually does. We tend to assume permanence comes from the biggest, heaviest, most deliberately built things in our lives. Stone outlives flesh, obviously. But it turns out stone can also quietly outlive an entire way of life standing empty over a family line it was never actually built to protect. There is a particular kind of quiet standing in a field in Falbigden today. Tourists occasionally wandering through a stone corridor built by hands that had no idea what they were actually building a monument to. Not to a family's strength exactly, though there was plenty of that too. More like a monument to how much any of us can survive right up until the moment we simply cannot survive it any longer. And here is where tonight's story is about to take a strikingly different turn, because the people who eventually filled the silence left behind by farming communities like this one did not come from anywhere nearby. They arrived from somewhere entirely different, riding animals most of Europe had never seen up close before, carrying an entirely different way of life, an entirely different way of burying their dead, and as we are about to find out, quite possibly carrying something else with them too, tucked quietly alongside everything else they brought across an entire continent. Let's meet them properly, because everything about how this next chapter unfolds depends on understanding exactly who these people were before we ever get to what they might have been carrying. Out on the vast windswept grasslands stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, in a region spanning parts of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, a pastoral people had spent generations learning how to survive in a landscape most farming societies would have taken one look at and simply walked away from. No forests worth mentioning, no easy rivers to settle beside permanently, just an endless rolling sea of grass stretching further than a person could walk in a lifetime, broken only by the occasional herd of cattle or sheep moving slowly across the horizon, and the people following behind them, always following season after season, chasing whatever patch of grazing land still had something left to offer. Archaeologists call these people the Yamnaya, and if that name sounds unfamiliar to you tonight, I would honestly be surprised if it stays that way for long, because very few groups in human history have left a heavier fingerprint on the modern world while remaining this quietly unknown to the general public. Here's a fun little detail before we go further, because I think it says something charming about how archaeology actually names things. The word Yamnaya simply comes from a Russian word meaning pit, a reference to the deep dug-out graves this culture buried its dead in underneath tall earthen mounds called kurgans. In other words, we named an entire vanished civilization, one that would go on to reshape the genetic makeup of an entire continent after a hole in the ground. There is something almost funny about that, honestly, and also something a little bit fitting, given how much of what we know about them still comes directly out of those very same holes. Their daily life revolved almost entirely around their animals. Cattle and sheep provided meat, milk and wool, the basic economy of an entire way of life measured out in herds rather than harvests. There was no wheat field to return to every autumn, no fixed plot of land whose success or failure decided whether a family ate well that winter. Success for the Yamnaya meant finding the next good stretch of grass before anyone else did, and having the speed and the transportation to actually get there first. So what actually set this particular group apart from every single community we have spent tonight walking through so far? Two things more than anything else, and both of them changed the pace of human history in ways that are honestly difficult to overstate. The first was the horse. People living on the steppe had been hunting horses for meat for a very long time before this, and researchers studying even earlier steppe communities have found evidence that horses were being managed, perhaps even milked, well before anyone climbed onto one's back with any real confidence. What people connected to the Yamnaya world figured out how to do, and refine and eventually turn into an entire way of life, was ride them properly, using them not just for food or milk, but as transportation itself. That single shift from seeing a horse as dinner to seeing a horse as a set of legs faster than your own turned out to be one of the most consequential technological leaps in the story of our species, arguably not matched in transformative power until the invention of the combustion engine thousands of years later. Suddenly, distances that would have taken a farming family on foot an entire season to cross could be covered in a fraction of the time. A landscape that looked empty and inhospitable to outsiders became to someone on horseback wide open and full of opportunity. The second was the wheel. Around this same general period, wheeled wagons started appearing across this same stretch of steppe. Heavy, sturdy things built to be pulled by oxen, capable of hauling an entire household's belongings, along with the very young, the very old, and anyone too sick or exhausted to walk. If you want a slightly playful way to picture it, these families had essentially invented the world's first camper van, minus the engine several thousand years before anyone thought to add one. Put those two inventions together, horses for speed and wagons for hauling, and you get something truly new in human history, a people who did not need to stay anywhere in particular, because their entire way of life could simply pack up and move with them. Can I be honest about why that detail matters so much to me? Every single person we've met tonight up until this point, Anya's family, the man we called Antsis, that Swedish farming lineage buried generation after generation in the very same stone chamber, all of them were fundamentally rooted to a place. Their entire identity was tied to a specific shoreline, a specific tomb, a specific patch of land their ancestors had already claimed, sometimes for hundreds of years, before they were even born. The Yamnaya broke that pattern entirely. Home for them was not a location. It was whoever happened to be travelling alongside you that particular season, the same wagon, the same fire, the same herd, wherever the grass happened to be growing thickest that year. There is something almost dizzying about trying to imagine that shift in perspective properly. Every community we have spent tonight walking through so far measured belonging by permanence, by how many generations had already been buried in the same patch of earth before you. This particular group measured belonging by momentum. Two completely different answers to the exact same basic human question, where do I actually belong? Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Which sounds more secure to you, honestly, an entire life built around one unmovable, deeply rooted piece of land the way every community we have covered tonight lived, or an entire life built around mobility itself, where the ability to simply leave becomes your greatest form of protection? I go back and forth on my own answer more than I expected to. Now, when it came time to bury their own dead, the Yamnaya did something that still stops modern archaeologists in their tracks. Beneath those tall earthen kurgans, prominent men were laid to rest with bronze weapons, ornate horse gear, and in some graves wheels or fragments of the very wagons that had carried them across the steppe during their lives. This particular burial style was first properly documented in the very early 1900s, by a Russian archaeologist named Vasily Gorodzov excavating along the Donets River, who noticed the same distinctive pit and mound pattern repeating across site after site, and realized he was looking at evidence of an entire previously unnamed culture hiding in plain sight beneath the open steppe the whole time. Look at what a society chooses to bury someone with, and you learn almost everything you need to know about what that society actually valued. These were not people preparing quietly for an afterlife of farming and stillness. They were people who expected to keep moving even after death. And move they eventually did in a way that still leaves professional historians a little breathless when they try to describe it properly. Beginning somewhere around 5,000 years ago, populations carrying this same steppe ancestry began pushing outward from their grassland homeland in multiple directions at once eastward, as far as the Altai Mountains near modern Mongolia, and westward deep into the heart of Europe. Within a handful of centuries, genetic material tracing back to this single steppe population had spread across a stretch of the map wider than most empires in recorded history would ever manage to control by force alone. Here is the detail that tends to leave people quietest once it actually sinks in. In parts of Europe, this migration did not simply add a new ingredient into an existing population. It substantially replaced what had been there before, especially along certain paternal genetic lines within a time frame far too short for that kind of shift to have happened gently. Researchers studying ancient remains from the British Isles, for instance, later found that within just a handful of centuries after this steppe ancestry first arrived, nearly the entire existing male genetic lineage on those islands had been displaced, overwhelmingly replaced by newcomers carrying this same steppe heritage. That is not the kind of number that happens through peaceful, gradual neighbourly mixing over many generations. That is the kind of number that tends to raise real uncomfortable questions about exactly how that transition actually played out on the ground. Questions historians and geneticists are still actively working through today, without any tidy, universally agreed upon answer yet. Was it outright conflict disease clearing the way first, a steep imbalance in status that shaped who had children with whom, or some uneasy combination of all three happening at once differently in different valleys and river crossings across the continent? Nobody currently studying this era would claim to have the full picture nailed down. A new farming culture that would eventually be called corded ware, named for the twisted cord patterns pressed into its pottery, emerged directly out of this collision, carrying a large majority of steppe ancestry inside it. If you've ever taken one of those consumer genetic tests and seen a percentage labelled something like steppe or Yamnaya-related ancestry, sitting quietly in your own results, this is exactly where that number traces back to whether you ever knew the name behind it or not. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, and I would love to hear where you land on this one. Now that you know the actual human story behind that steppe percentage sitting quietly in your own results, does it change how you think about it even a little? I want to sit with the sheer scale of that shift for just a moment longer, because I think it deserves more weight than a quick mention. We're talking about a genetic and cultural transformation sweeping across an entire continent within roughly the same span of time it took that one Swedish family we just left behind to bury 6 generations inside a single stone tomb. One story moves at the patient-rooted pace of a community that never left its own land. The other moves like weather. Entire language families, entire genetic signatures, entire ways of organizing a family and a household, rewritten across a landmass wider than most modern countries, in less time than it takes some family trees to fill out a single family plot. And somewhere in the gap between those two speeds sits an uncomfortable question worth asking. Honestly, what happens to the people already living somewhere when an entirely new population arrives with better mobility, better weapons, and as we are about to spend real time exploring quite possibly something else entirely riding along with them that nobody could see coming? It also helps to understand what these newcomers were actually riding into, because timing here matters more than it might first appear. We already spent real time tonight walking through the quiet, generations-long collapse of farming communities across parts of northern Europe, populations weakened by repeated waves of disease long before any newcomer ever crossed their horizon. A landscape with fewer people, weaker communities and less resistance standing in the way does not need to be conquered through force alone. Sometimes it simply needs to be entered. I'm not saying that connection explains everything about this migration, and I want to be careful here because history rarely hands us one single clean cause for anything this enormous. Climate shifts on the steppe itself likely played a role too. Drier seasons, pushing herds and the families depending on them further and further afield in search of grass that had not yet been picked clean. Simple population pressure probably mattered as well, more mouths to feed than the grassland could comfortably support forever, the kind of quiet grinding math that eventually pushes any growing population to look outward. But it is worth sitting with the timing regardless. A vulnerable, thinned-out Europe on one side, still recovering from generations of quiet loss we spent real time on earlier tonight. A newly mobile, rapidly expanding population on the other riding animals. Nobody in Europe had ever seen ridden before hauling wagons. Nobody in Europe had ever seen roll across their own land. Two enormous historical forces arriving almost on top of each other, and history rarely wastes a coincidence quite that convenient. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we move any further into tonight's story. When you picture a historical migration reshaping an entire continent, do you usually picture conquest armies, deliberate invasion, or is there a part of you that can also picture something quieter, more opportunistic, simply a stronger, faster, more mobile group filling a space that had already been weakened long before they ever arrived? I think the honest answer probably sits somewhere between both of those pictures, and that particular grey area is exactly where real history usually likes to hide. And there is one more detail about these particular travellers worth sitting with before we go any further tonight, something that connects them directly back to everything we have spent this entire evening tracing. When researchers eventually went looking through the genetic remains of people connected to this exact migration, they were not only searching for horse bones and wagon fragments, they went looking for something else entirely, something considerably smaller and considerably more familiar to us by this point in the story, tucked away quietly in bone and tooth, the same way we have already learned to find it beside a Siberian lake, inside a Latvian shell midden, and underneath a Swedish stone tomb. What they found did not just confirm a hunch. It handed researchers an entirely new way of tracing exactly how, and exactly how far this bacterium had actually travelled once it finally caught a ride with people who no longer had any intention of staying put. So let's go there next, because it turns out these riders from the Grass Sea were not travelling alone. Here is what researchers actually found once they started looking closely at the genetic remains connected to this migration, and I think it might be one of the most quietly persuasive pieces of evidence in this entire story so far. The exact same bacterium we've been tracing all night long, the very same organism that swept through a hunting camp in Siberia, that ended one man's life alone in a Latvian shell midden, that returned again and again to a single Swedish family across 6 generations, turns up inside the remains of people connected to this steppe migration too. Not scattered randomly across the map, the way you might expect from a dozen separate unrelated spillover events, happening independently in a dozen unconnected places. It shows up specifically tracing the exact same path these travellers took, appearing in Central and Western Europe, right around the time this new population was arriving there, and largely absent from those same regions beforehand. Follow the migration on a map, mark every single place this organism has now turned up, and the two maps line up with an accuracy that stops feeling like coincidence fairly quickly. In other words, the pathogen was not simply floating around Europe waiting to be discovered wherever anyone happened to look. It was moving with somebody, and that somebody was riding a horse. Can I sit with that image for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Every single outbreak we have covered so far tonight has been in its own way a local event. A hunting camp beside one lake, one man in one grave, one farming family in one tomb. This is the first time in tonight's entire story that the bacterium itself appears to be doing something closer to travelling on purpose, riding along at the exact speed and along the exact route of an entire population on the move rather than simply waiting quietly in one place for the next unlucky person to stumble into it. If earlier chapters of tonight's story were quiet local tragedies, this one is closer to watching a single storm system finally pick up enough speed to start tracking across an entire weather map. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. Does it feel different to you hearing that this organism did not just spread through scattered accidents the way it had everywhere else we have visited tonight, but instead appears to have hitched an actual sustained ride alongside one specific group of people crossing an entire continent? I know it changed something for me the first time I really understood what that pattern was showing. Now this naturally raises an uncomfortable question. One researchers in this field debate honestly, rather than settle neatly, and I think it deserves the same honesty here. Did this bacterium somehow help clear the way for this migration, weakening the communities already living across Europe before the newcomers ever arrived, making room in a sense for a population already moving in large numbers? Or was it simply riding along for the journey, present, real, occasionally deadly, but not actually the reason this particular migration succeeded as dramatically as it did? I want to be careful here because I think this is exactly the kind of question a video like this one could very easily oversimplify for the sake of a cleaner story, and I would rather give you the messier, more honest version instead. The timing lines up in a way that is honestly suggestive, but timing lining up is not the same thing as proof of cause and effect, and serious researchers studying this era are still actively working through how much weight to put on that overlap. It might be that disease weakened existing populations, first leaving fewer people and fewer defenders behind by the time newcomers arrived. It might be that the newcomers simply outcompeted existing populations through sheer mobility, better weapons, and larger herds, with the disease riding along as an unrelated passenger rather than a driving cause. It might honestly be some uneasy mixture of both different in every valley and river crossing this migration eventually reached. Nobody currently studying this era has a tidy, complete answer, and I trust the ones being honest about that uncertainty far more than the ones pretending otherwise. I think part of what makes this particular question so difficult is that it asks history to hand us a single villain, one clean, satisfying explanation we can point to, and say, there, that is what did it. Real historical collapse almost never works that way. It is rarely one dramatic cause doing all the damage alone. It tends to be several smaller pressures arriving at roughly the same time, each one making the others slightly worse, until the whole structure gives way together, and untangling exactly how much blame belongs to which pressure, thousands of years after the fact, using nothing but bone and genetic code, may honestly be asking more of the evidence than it can fully deliver. I bring that up now because I think it is worth remembering every time a video like this one, including this one, hands you a tidy-sounding theory. The honest version of history almost always has looser edges than the story we would prefer to tell about it. There is, however, one discovery connected to this exact chapter of the story that I think changes the picture in a very specific, very concrete way, and it did not come from a human grave at all. In the 3rd millennium before the current era, somewhere out across that same vast stretch of Eurasian steppe, we spent real time exploring an animal died carrying this exact same ancient lineage of the bacterium inside it. Not a marmot, not a beaver, a domesticated sheep. There is a small additional detail buried inside this particular discovery that I find quietly fascinating, one worth including, because it deepens the picture even further. When researchers examined the sheep itself, not just the bacterium riding inside it, they found its own genetic ancestry traced back toward populations of sheep further south, closer to the farming communities of Southwest Asia, rather than being a purely local steppe animal from birth. Which means this particular sheep was itself a product of exactly the same kind of long-distance contact and exchange. We have been tracing all night cultural connections and trade networks stretching between early farming societies and the steppe pastoralists eventually descended from groups like the Yamnaya. Even the animal carrying the evidence had its own quiet migration story tangled up inside its bones. Sit with that for a second, because I think it deserves real weight. Every single animal connection we've talked about tonight up until this point has been a wild one, an occasional unlucky brush with a creature these communities hunted or trapped, rather than one they actually lived alongside every single day. This is something different entirely. Sheep were not an occasional encounter for these steppe pastoralists. Sheep were the foundation of an entire way of life. Herded, milked, slaughtered, slept, near worn as wool against the cold present in every single day of a family's existence, rather than one dangerous afternoon out hunting. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, and I would love to hear where you land on this one. Which sounds more unsettling to you, honestly, catching a rare, dangerous disease from an occasional risky hunt, the way we have talked about for most of tonight, or discovering that the exact same danger might have been quietly present inside animals your entire community depended on and touched constantly every single day without a second thought. Because that is essentially what this discovery suggests. If this particular lineage of the bacterium could establish itself inside a domesticated flock, not just an occasional wild spillover event, but a genuine ongoing presence inside the very animals these pastoralist families were milking and slaughtering and sleeping beside on a daily basis, then the entire math of exposure changes completely. A hunting people face this risk occasionally tied to specific identifiable moments, a single dangerous afternoon chasing a single dangerous animal. A pastoralist people, carrying their infected herds along with them day after day, mile after mile across an entire continent, face something closer to a low constant hum of risk woven quietly into the most ordinary parts of daily life imaginable. Feeding the animals, shearing the animals, simply walking beside them. Think about the closest modern equivalent you can honestly something so routine you would never once think to worry about it. Milking a herd or even just standing near one was not a special occasion for these families. It was simply Tuesday, the same ordinary Tuesday we already talked about a while back tonight. Except now the danger was not hiding in one particular hunt out on the hills. It was potentially standing right beside the family fire every single evening, wearing wool, providing milk, being loved and depended upon in exactly the same breath that it may have quietly been carrying something none of them could ever have seen coming. I think that detail alone goes a long way toward explaining how this particular bacterium managed to travel as far and as fast as the genetic evidence now shows it did. It did not need to wait patiently for the next unlucky hunter to wander too close to the wrong burrow. It had quite possibly already found a much steadier ride tucked quietly inside the exact animals an entire migrating civilization could not survive without. There is one more piece of this particular puzzle worth including, a small technical detail that carries real weight once you understand what it actually means. When researchers compared this bacterium's genetic makeup across all the different locations where it has now been found stretching from that original Siberian shoreline all the way into the heart of Europe, they notice something almost paradoxical. Despite covering an enormous geographic distance, the organism showed remarkably little regional variation. Almost none of the local genetic drift you would expect from a pathogen that had been quietly settling down and evolving independently in dozens of separate locations over many centuries. Instead, it looked strikingly uniform, almost as if it simply had not had enough time sitting still in any one place to start developing meaningfully distinct local versions of itself. Think of it almost like comparing two different kinds of accents. A language that has stayed rooted in one valley for 1,000 years tends to drift into something locals 2 towns over can barely understand anymore. All those small gradual changes piling up, the longer nobody moves anywhere. A language carried rapidly across a continent by people constantly on the move, by contrast, tends to stay far more uniform simply because it never sits still long enough in any one place to fully drift apart. This bacterium's genetic code was behaving far more like the second kind of language than the first. Think about what that actually tells us. A pathogen that stays in one place for centuries tends to drift to specialize, to grow subtly different from population to population the longer it sits still. This one did not do that, which strongly suggests it was not settling anywhere for very long at all. It was moving consistently across huge distances, at a pace that barely gave it time to change before it arrived somewhere new. That is not the genetic signature of a disease quietly smouldering in the background of static communities. That is the genetic signature of something being carried actively, continuously by people, and by the herds those people refuse to leave behind. I keep coming back to the shape of that irony, if I'm honest with you. Everything that made this particular group of people so remarkably successful, their mobility, their enormous herds, their refusal to stay rooted to any single patch of land, the way every other community we have met tonight, may have been precisely the same set of qualities that let this ancient killer travel further, faster, and more efficiently than it ever had before in its entire existence up to that point. Success and vulnerability riding together in the very same wagon. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Do you think the Yamnaya themselves ever noticed a pattern here, ever quietly connected their own extraordinary mobility to the strange occasional sicknesses that seem to follow certain herds or certain families more than others? Or did it simply feel to them like ordinary bad luck scattered across an otherwise successful, expanding way of life? The same way it must have felt to every single community we have visited tonight. I suspect it was the second one. Hindsight is the only reason any of us get to see the pattern at all, and that quiet, uncomfortable partnership did not stop somewhere in the middle of the European continent either. It kept moving generation after generation, family after family, further than almost anyone studying this era originally expected it to reach, all the way to a stretch of coastline most people picture as about as far removed from a Siberian steppe as anywhere on the map could possibly be. If you had told the families we first met tonight that whatever was moving through their world would eventually wash up on the edge of an island most of them never even knew existed, I doubt a single one of them would have believed you. So let's follow it there next, because it turns out this particular thread does not end in the heart of Europe at all. It runs all the way to the edge of it. Cross the water now, because the edge of the world I promised you is not some poetic exaggeration tonight. It is an actual island separated from the rest of the continent by open sea, the kind of geographic barrier that should in theory have made it one of the hardest places on the entire map for anything to reach on foot or on horseback, or riding quietly inside an infected animal. In the rolling limestone hills of Somerset, in the southwest corner of England, there is a place called Charterhouse Warren, and if you have never heard that name before tonight, I want to warn you gently that what archaeologists found there is honestly difficult to sit with. I am going to walk you through it carefully and with real restraint because I think the story deserves honesty rather than shock value. But I want you to know up front that this particular chapter carries more weight than most of what we have covered so far tonight. Sometime between roughly 4,000 and 4,200 years ago, at the bottom of a natural limestone shaft plunging nearly 15 meters straight down into the earth, the remains of at least 37 people were deposited. Archaeologists first excavated this particular shaft back in the 1970s, And even then, something about it clearly troubled the people doing the digging. It would take until quite recently, with the help of modern analytical tools nobody working that original excavation could have imagined, for researchers to fully understand exactly what they had actually found. Men, women, children, great many children old enough to have been full members of their community, young enough that their deaths represent something closer to the deliberate ending of an entire generation, rather than simple ordinary bad luck. Every single one of them showed clear evidence of violent death. Nearly half the skulls recovered from that shaft carried unmistakable signs of trauma. Chemical analysis of the victim's own teeth, the same kind of analysis we have talked about before tonight in a very different context, showed that most of these people had grown up locally, in this same corner of England, rather than arriving as strangers or outsiders. Whatever happened here, it happened largely to people who belonged to this land, not to some foreign group passing through. And unlike almost every other burial site we have visited together tonight, there was no gentle ritual here, no careful placement, no red ochre pressed lovingly around a small body the way we witnessed beside that Siberian lake at the very beginning of this story. Just a shaft in the ground and everyone who once called this community home. The researcher leading the most recent study of this site put it about as plainly as any historian ever puts something this disturbing. Britain's Bronze Age, broadly speaking, was not a violent period, at least not compared to what came both before it and after it, which makes Charterhouse Warren almost impossible to explain away as ordinary conflict. This was something else entirely, a scale and intensity of violence that has no real parallel anywhere else in the archaeological record of prehistoric Britain. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment gently, because I think it deserves space rather than a quick answer. What could possibly drive an entire community to turn on another entire community with that much force, that much intention, in a world without armies, without written law, without any of the large-scale organized violence we usually associate with history's worst chapters? I do not have a satisfying answer for you tonight. Neither, honestly, does anyone currently studying this site, and this is exactly where our particular story, the one we have been tracing all night, quietly re-enters the picture, tucked inside the teeth of two children recovered from that same shaft, both somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. When they died, researchers found unmistakable genetic evidence of the very same bacterium we have followed from a Siberian shoreline through a lonely Latvian grave, across a Swedish family tomb, and along an entire continent behind a migrating population on horseback. By every measure available to modern science, these two children were infected with plague at the time of their deaths. Can I be honest about how strange and how truly uncertain this next part of the story actually is? Because I think it would be dishonest of me to hand you a tidy explanation here, and I trust you enough tonight to give you the real, unresolved version instead. A doctoral researcher at the Francis Crick Institute named Pooja Swali led the genetic side of this particular investigation, the same institute doing much of the pioneering work we discussed earlier tonight, when we talked about how any of this reading ancient bone technology actually functions. By her own account, actually detecting a pathogen, this degraded hiding inside a single child's tooth from a burial, this chaotic still felt close to unbelievable, even to someone who works in this exact field every single day. I find something quietly reassuring in that reaction, honestly. Even the experts who make discoveries like this one for a living do not fully stop being amazed by what modern science can actually pull out of the past. It is tempting, almost irresistibly so, to connect these two facts into one clean, satisfying narrative. A community discovers plague moving through some of its members. Fear takes hold. That fear curdles into violence, an entire group turning on those they believe carry a dangerous invisible curse ending in that terrible shaft. It would explain so much. It would give this senseless tragedy a shape we could actually make sense of. But the researchers who have spent years studying this site are, to their enormous credit, resisting exactly that temptation because the physical evidence does not sit comfortably with it. Whatever happened to the bodies in that shaft after death involved extensive, deliberate, close physical handling, the kind of prolonged, intimate contact that people truly afraid of. A contagious, deadly illness would have every reason to avoid rather than engage in. If this community truly believed they were dealing with a dangerous plague, going out of their way to handle the dead so extensively afterward makes very little practical sense. Fear of contagion tends to make people keep their distance, not draw closer, so the plague may simply have been present quietly, coincidentally inside two children, who also happened to die in an entirely unrelated act of violence, a devastating but ultimately separate tragedy, layered directly on top of another. Or the connection might be real, just not in the straightforward way we would instinctively want to imagine it. Some more complicated social or political tension we simply do not have enough evidence to reconstruct properly thousands of years after the fact. The honest answer tonight is that nobody currently studying this site actually knows, and I respect every single researcher involved enough to tell you that, plainly, rather than inventing false certainty just to give tonight's story a cleaner ending. I think there is a real lesson hiding in that refusal to force an answer, one worth carrying with you well beyond tonight's story. Not every two devastating things that happen in the same place at roughly the same time are actually connected. Sometimes tragedy simply happens more than once, independently to the very same unlucky group of people, and our instinct to weave every coincidence into one tidy explanation says more about how our own minds work than it does about how history actually unfolded. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment gently. Does it unsettle you more to imagine these two tragedies as connected, one directly causing the other, or to imagine them as two separate, unrelated horrors that simply happen to collide inside the very same small community at the very same moment in time? I want to step away from that shaft for a moment because there is a second British site connected to this same chapter of the story, and the contrast between the two is almost impossible to ignore once you see them sitting side by side. Roughly 200 miles north in the county of Cumbria, near a quiet stretch of English countryside, archaeologists studying a very different kind of monument. A circular arrangement of stones known as a ring cairn found the remains of 4 individuals buried with obvious care in a manner entirely typical of respectful burial practice for that era. This particular excavation worth mentioning because it says something lovely about how this kind of research actually gets done, involved close collaboration with a local history group and a small regional museum, ordinary community members working alongside professional researchers to help piece together their own local past. One of those 4 individuals also carried genetic evidence of the very same bacterium. No shaft, no trauma, no unresolved mystery layered on top of the diagnosis. Simply one more quiet, dignified grave, holding one more person whose body happened to be carrying something history would not fully understand for another 4,000 years. I think that contrast matters more than it might first appear. The exact same organism moving through 2 completely different communities met with 2 completely different fates. One ended in what may be the single most violent event known anywhere in prehistoric British archaeology. The other ended in a peaceful stone monument tended with the same quiet care every other respectful burial in this story has received. The disease itself does not seem to explain that difference. Something about the specific people, the specific community, the specific circumstances each family found itself in did. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had to guess blindly which of these two outcomes feels more representative of how most communities across ancient Britain actually handled sickness and death, during this era, the quiet dignity of that ring cairn, or the chaos of that shaft, I would put real money on the quiet grave being closer to the norm, and Charterhouse Warren being the rare, terrible exception that simply happened to survive well enough for us to study it in this much detail. Which is in its own way a strangely hopeful thought buried inside an otherwise difficult chapter of tonight's story. Now here is the detail that ties this entire British chapter directly back to everything we spent real time on earlier tonight. When researchers examined the genetic makeup of the strain recovered from both these sites, they found it belonged to the exact same broader family of the bacterium already documented moving through Central Europe. During this same general period, the very lineage we watched travel alongside an entire migrating population and their herds. Alongside these burials, archaeologists also recovered a distinctive style of pottery known as beaker ware, decorated with fine pressed cord patterns, not entirely unlike the corded ware tradition we talked about earlier tonight, a style closely associated with exactly the kind of long-distance cultural connections, and quite possibly the same population movements we spent real time exploring only a little while ago. The physical objects buried alongside these people were quietly telling the same story the bacterium's own genetic code was telling. This was not some isolated freak occurrence unrelated to anything else in tonight's story. It was the furthest known edge of a wave that had already crossed an entire continent to get here, arriving on an island that anyone back at that Siberian lake 5,000 years earlier would never have believed existed at all. And one more detail worth sitting with before we move forward tonight. Even this far from where our story began, even after crossing open water to reach an island, most of the communities we met earlier in this story would never have known existed. This particular strain still had not picked up the one genetic tool that would eventually define this disease's most infamous chapter. No flea-adapted version yet. No efficient rapid transmission cycle capable of tearing through crowded medieval cities within weeks. Whatever happened in that shaft, whatever quiet grief settled over that stone monument in Cumbria, both of them involved a version of this organism that was in the strictest technical sense still incomplete, still missing the single piece of genetic machinery that would one day turn it into the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. Think about how far we have travelled together tonight, and how far this bacterium had already travelled right alongside us, and it still had not become the thing most of us actually think of when someone says the word plague. 5,000 years of quiet, scattered devastation. Family by family, community by community, an entire continent crossed on foot and horseback and wagon wheel, and the single most consequential upgrade in this organism's entire history had, as far as we know, tonight still not happened yet. Which means the true turning point in this entire story, the moment everything changes, has not happened yet either. Not in Siberia, not in Latvia, not in Sweden, not here at the very edge of the known world. Somewhere at some point we have not yet visited tonight. This organism finally picked up the missing piece, and once it did, it would never again be limited to the slow, quiet, occasionally devastating pattern we've spent this entire evening tracing. So let's go find that moment next, because it turns out the bite that would eventually change everything did not happen anywhere near where you might expect. Here is the twist I promised you, and I think it might be my favourite piece of misdirection in this entire story tonight, because if you had asked me to guess where this particular chapter unfolds, before I actually did the research myself, I would have guessed completely wrong too. We are not heading further into Western Europe. We are not creeping any closer to the crowded medieval cities most of us instinctively associate with this disease's worst chapter. Instead, we are turning around entirely, heading back east, deep into the heart of the continent, to a stretch of land along the Volga River in what is now Russia, in a region called Samara. If that name sounds familiar tonight, it should. It sits almost directly along the same corridor of steppe we spent real time exploring earlier of the very homeland this entire story's most restless, most mobile population once called their own. Same rivers roughly, same open grassland stretching toward the same distant horizon. A place this story has technically already visited once tonight, without either of us realizing at the time that we would eventually need to circle all the way back. Roughly 3,800 years ago, in that same stretch of land, something changed inside this bacterium that had never fully changed before, not in the 5,000 years and several thousand miles we have already travelled together tonight. Before we get to what exactly changed, I want to sit with the timing for a moment because it carries its own quiet poetry. We spent real time earlier tonight watching a mobile horse riding population sweep out of this exact region and reshape an entire continent, carrying their herds, their language, and quite possibly this very organism along with them into Europe. What most people do not expect, and what honestly surprised me the first time I came across it, is that history was not finished moving through this particular stretch of land. Centuries later, some of the descendants of those very same populations carrying newly mixed ancestry, picked up from the farming communities they had encountered out in Europe, began drifting back eastward, returning toward the steppe their own ancestors had once left behind. Researchers studying this era have given these later cultures their own names, groups like the Sintashta and the Andronovo, populations whose genetic makeup shows clear evidence of this reverse journey, a slow, generations-long migration, flowing in the opposite direction from the one we already spent time tracing. Can I be honest about how much that detail moved me once I really sat with it? This entire story up until this exact moment tonight has felt like it was moving in one direction outward, away from a Siberian lake further and further across an ever-expanding map, and then quietly, without any fanfare part of that same current, simply turned around and started flowing home again. History rarely moves in one straight tidy line, no matter how much a good story might want it to, and it is inside the remains of people connected to this exact reverse migration, back on the very steppe this whole story first began circling around, that researchers finally found what they had been looking for. The bacterium at long last had picked up the missing piece. Here's a quick refresher, since it has been a while since we talked about this directly. Every single version of this organism we have followed tonight, from that Siberian hunting camp all the way to a shaft in the English countryside, lacked one specific genetic tool, a particular gene that lets the bacterium survive and multiply inside a flea's digestive tract long enough to physically block it, turning a simple insect bite into an efficient, repeatable delivery system for infection. Without that tool, this organism had to rely on messier, less efficient routes, close contact with infected animals, or person-to-person spread through coughing and shared breath. Effective in its own brutal way, as we have seen again and again tonight, but nowhere near as efficient and nowhere near as terrifying as what was still waiting to be unlocked. There is a small but important piece of this puzzle worth adding here, because it connects directly to the very image most of us actually associate with this disease. That familiar picture, swollen lumps forming near a bite, the symptom history, eventually built an entire name around, only really becomes common once a bacterium is being delivered efficiently and repeatedly through flea bites, specifically allowing the infection to settle first into the nearest lymph nodes before spreading further. Every single outbreak we've walked through tonight up until this exact moment involved a version of the organism that mostly bypassed that particular pathway entirely moving instead through the bloodstream or the lungs. Which means, in a strange way, the disease most of us picture first when we hear the word plague. The swollen visible warning sign is actually one of the later developments in this entire 5,000-year story, not the original version at all. In these late Bronze Age remains from Samara, researchers finally found a version of the bacterium carrying that exact gene fully present, fully functional. And this discovery did something more than simply add one more data point to tonight's story. It rewrote the entire known timeline for when this particular transformation actually happened. Before this find, the earliest confident evidence for a flea-adapted strain came from a roughly 2,900-year-old sample, recovered in Armenia, though even that particular piece of evidence was frustratingly incomplete, too degraded to fully confirm with real scientific confidence. What turned up in Samara pushed that timeline back by well over 1,000 years, showing that the single most consequential upgrade in this organism's entire existence happened far earlier than almost anyone in this field had previously believed. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Does it surprise you that something this significant, arguably the single most important evolutionary event in the entire 5,000-year story we have walked through together tonight, happened quietly on a riverbank in Russia, completely unnoticed by anyone alive to witness it, rather than in some dramatic documented moment we could point to directly? I keep coming back to something we talked about earlier tonight too when we first met this organism properly, and learned that its most famous weapon likely was not something it built entirely on its own. Researchers studying this exact genetic tool believe it was probably picked up from an entirely different bacterium through that strange sideways process of genetic exchange. We discussed a while back small loops of genetic material passing between unrelated organisms, almost like a favour exchange between neighbours who happen to be sharing the exact same crowded, chaotic environment. And what a specific environment that would have been. A stretch of steppe, experiencing exactly the kind of upheaval that tends to throw unrelated organisms into closer contact than usual, populations moving herds, mixing entire communities relocating across long distances, carrying whatever else happened to be travelling along quietly inside them. If you will allow me one slightly playful comparison here, it is almost as if this particular bacterium spent thousands of years as a supporting character, competent, dangerous in its own way, but missing the one signature move that would eventually make it famous. And then on a riverbank in Russia, surrounded by exactly the right chaos, at exactly the right moment it finally picked up that move from somebody else, entirely the way a musician might casually borrow a riff from a stranger at a crowded jam session, and go on to build an entire career out of it, with nobody at that original jam session ever fully realizing what they had just handed away. It makes a strange kind of sense, honestly, that a moment of such enormous biological consequence would happen during a moment of such enormous human upheaval. Change tends to breed more change. Chaos on every level seems to create exactly the kind of conditions where something new can slip through unnoticed. Now here is the part of tonight's story that I think deserves the most careful attention, because it is easy to assume that a discovery this significant must have led immediately to catastrophe. It did not. Not for a very long time. This particular genetic upgrade appeared roughly 3,800 years ago, the Black Death. The pandemic most of us actually picture when we hear the word plague would not sweep through Europe for another 3,300 years after that. Think about the sheer size of that gap. This organism had, in the strictest technical sense, everything it needed to become history's most devastating pandemic for well over 3 millennia before it actually managed to do so. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, and I would love to hear where you land on this one. If a weapon this dangerous had already been fully assembled that early, what do you think was actually missing? Because clearly having the tool was never quite enough on its own. The honest answer, as far as researchers currently understand it, comes down to opportunity rather than capability. A flea-adapted, fully weaponized version of this bacterium is still, at the end of the day, only as dangerous as the world it happens to find itself moving through. Scattered mobile populations living across open steppe and quiet farming villages simply did not offer the same kind of target that later far more crowded cities eventually would. You need dense populations living close together. You need thriving trade routes carrying goods, and the rodents that inevitably travel alongside those goods across huge distances quickly. You need granaries and warehouses and crowded ports, exactly the kind of infrastructure that quietly builds a perfect highway system for both merchants and vermin without anyone intending it to. None of that existed yet in most of Europe or Central Asia during the Bronze Age, but very much would exist in overwhelming abundance by the time the 14th century of the current era finally arrived, when caravans and cargo ships had stitched together trade networks stretching from the Black Sea all the way to the heart of Asia. I think there is something worth sitting within that gap, honestly, something that reaches well beyond just this one bacterium. Having the tool to cause enormous damage and actually being positioned to cause that damage turn out to be two completely separate things, separated here by well over 3,000 years of simply waiting for the right circumstances to line up. It is almost like watching a performer finish learning every single skill they will ever need for the biggest role of their entire career, and then having to wait more than 3,000 years for anyone to actually build the stage. That waiting, by the way, was not empty or uneventful. This flea-adapted version of the organism did not simply vanish back into obscurity for 3,000 years after this discovery. It continued circulating, continued causing outbreaks, continued quietly shaping smaller chapters of history. We simply have not had time to walk through together tonight. Individual tragedies scattered across those intervening centuries, the same way we have spent this entire evening uncovering one after another. What it lacked for all that time was not virulence, and now at long last not transmissibility either. What it lacked was scale, and scale it would eventually discover was simply a matter of waiting for humanity to build the right kind of world for it to finally take full advantage of. I find myself thinking about all those centuries in between more than I expected to tonight. All those smaller outbreaks that never grew into anything resembling a headline. All those families who faced this exact same organism, now fully weaponized, and somehow still managed through nothing more than distance and low population density to avoid the worst of what it was now fully capable of doing. There is a strange kind of mercy buried inside that gap, even if nobody living through it would have recognized it as mercy at the time. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we wrap up this particular chapter. Does it change how you think about danger in general, knowing that the most infamous version of this disease was fully capable, fully assembled for more than 3,000 years before it actually got its chance, I think, about that idea? Well beyond just this one bacterium, honestly. How many things in our own world right now might already be fully capable of causing enormous change, simply waiting quietly for the right circumstances to finally line up? And then slowly, unmistakably, the world finally started building exactly the kind of stage this particular performer had been waiting for. Cities grew larger, trade routes stretched further and connected more densely than ever before, threading together distant regions that had barely known of each other's existence only a few centuries earlier. And somewhere inside all of that growth, all of that human progress and ambition, and interconnected commerce, the conditions finally aligned for this organism to do something it had technically been capable of doing for over 3,000 years, but had simply never before had the opportunity to attempt at full scale. So let's go there next, because it turns out the story we have been building all night, piece by piece, grave by grave, continent by continent, is about to arrive exactly where you probably expected it to end up from the very beginning. And once it does, we finally get to complete the circle all the way back to that quiet Siberian shoreline where all of this started. We finally arrive there now, the place this entire story has been quietly walking towards since the very first grave we stood beside tonight. In the autumn of 1347, a handful of trading ships sailed into the harbour of Messina in Sicily, carrying goods from ports much further east. The same kind of long, interconnected trade routes we spent real-time tracing. Earlier tonight only now stretched even further, linking the Black Sea all the way to the busiest ports of the Mediterranean. Most of the sailors on board those ships were already dead by the time they arrived, and the few still standing at the rails could barely manage to bring the vessels safely into harbour. The ones still breathing would not stay that way for long. Within days, the sickness moving through those ships had reached the shore, and within a handful of years it had swept across nearly the entire continent of Europe, following trade routes, river crossings, and crowded city streets, with a speed and a scale nothing in that region had ever witnessed before. Somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population, by the most careful modern estimates, did not survive it. Whole towns emptied out. Fields went unharvested because there was nobody left healthy enough to bring in the crop. History eventually settled on a name for it, one that has outlived nearly every other event from that entire century, the Black Death. I am not going to spend a great deal of time walking you through details you likely already know at least a little about, because that particular story has been told many times, by many people far more thoroughly than we have room for tonight. What I want to sit with instead is something most of those retellings tend to leave out entirely, something that only really becomes visible once you have spent an entire evening the way we just have together walking the long road that led up to that harbour in Sicily. The Black Death was never actually a beginning. By the time those ships reached Messina, the organism responsible for it had already been quietly present in the world for roughly 5,500 years. It had already claimed children beside a Siberian lake, a lone hunter in a Latvian shell midden. 6 generations of one Swedish family, a shaft full of the dead in the English countryside, and countless smaller unrecorded tragedies scattered across that entire span of time that no grave ever survived long enough for us to find. What arrived in Sicily in 1347 was not a new villain making its debut. It was the same organism we have spent this entire night getting to know. Finally standing on the stage, it had been technically capable of filling for well over 3,000 years, in a world that had finally grown crowded enough, connected enough and mobile enough to let it perform at a scale nobody before that century had ever witnessed. Can I be honest about how that reframes the entire story for me even now, after having researched every piece of it? We tend to treat the Black Death as history's opening chapter on this particular subject the moment plague enters the human story. Tonight, I hope, has made it clear that the truth is almost the opposite. The Black Death was not the beginning of anything. It was closer to the loudest, most devastating verse of a song that had already been quietly playing for over 5,000 years, mostly to audiences too small, too scattered and too far removed from written history for anyone to properly record what they were hearing. Think about everywhere that song had already quietly played before anyone in Sicily ever saw those ships arrive. A hunting camp beside a Siberian lake, where an entire summer's worth of children went quiet within a matter of days. A lone shell midden on the Baltic coast holding a single man whose own branch of this story simply ended with nobody left to carry it any further. A stone tomb in a Swedish field reopened generation after generation, quietly recording the same family's return visits from an enemy none of them could name. A rolling grassland corridor stretching across an entire continent, carrying this organism along in the very same herds and wagons that were reshaping the genetic map of Europe. A shaft in the English countryside holding a tragedy modern science still cannot fully explain, and a riverbank in Russia where without any fanfare at all this organism quietly finished assembling the exact tool it would eventually need to do what it did in Sicily. Every single one of those moments was a verse in the same song. Sicily was simply the first time the whole world was finally listening at once, and this particular organism did not simply retire once that famous chapter finally ended either. 3 centuries later, in 1665, it returned to the streets of London, specifically killing close to 100,000 people in a single city over the course of about 18 months, close to a quarter of that city's entire population at the time. Even that was not the closing chapter. Smaller outbreaks continued flaring up across parts of the world for centuries afterward, and if it surprises you to hear this, the organism itself has never actually gone extinct. It is still here today, quietly persisting in wild rodent populations across parts of the world, including, and I know this might catch a few of you off guard right here in parts of the western United States. Ground squirrels, prairie dogs, and other small burrowing rodents across states like New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California still carry it quietly among themselves. The same basic ecological pattern we talked about all the way back at that Siberian lake, just wearing a different regional cast of animal characters. A handful of human cases still turn up most years, almost always traced back to contact with wild animals or their fleas, and almost always treatable now with modern antibiotics that this story's very first victims could never have imagined existing. The same organism, the same basic pattern of an animal, a flea and an unlucky moment of contact, just separated from Anya's world by 5,500 years, and by the extraordinary luck of modern medicine standing ready to intervene. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, one I think this entire story has been quietly building toward the whole night. Does it change how you think about a disease like this one, knowing it never actually disappeared, that it simply learned slowly a little more each century how to occasionally step back out of the shadows? It mostly prefers to stay hidden inside. I want to bring us back now gently to exactly where we started tonight, because I think this particular story only really finishes properly if we complete that circle all the way. Somewhere on the cold shore of a Siberian lake over 5,000 years before any of the events we just walked through, a woman we chose to call Anya knelt beside her son through his final night, and then only days later beside her daughter too. She had no name for what was moving through her family, no understanding of bacteria or genetics or flea gut biology, or any of the careful science that eventually let modern researchers read her family's entire tragedy out of a few fragments of ancient bone. All she had was grief and love and the terrible ordinary work of burying 2 children within the same difficult season. And here is the thought I keep returning to more than any single fact we covered tonight. Everything that happened after Anya, the Latvian hunter, buried alone the Swedish family in their stone tomb, the riders sweeping out of the grasslands, the shaft in the English countryside, the harbour in Sicily, the streets of London 3 centuries later, all of it, every single thread traces directly back to the same quiet, devastating grief Anya carried through that one terrible summer beside the water. She could not have known any of what would eventually follow. She only knew what every parent throughout this entire 5,000-year story has known in exactly the same aching, immediate way. Loving someone and then losing them to something too small to see and too old to fully understand. If you go back and picture her one more time, kneeling in that darkness beside the water, I do not think she would recognize a single word of tonight's story, the genetics, the migrations, the maps stretching across entire continents. But I think she would recognize the shape of it instantly. The shape of loving someone completely and losing them anyway, and somehow finding the strength to keep living beside the very same water the next morning. That part of the story never needed translating. It has stayed exactly the same from her night beside that lake to whatever night you happen to be listening from right now. And maybe that is the real reason a story like this one is worth telling slowly, properly across an entire evening, rather than rushing through it in a few tidy minutes. Not because the science is not fascinating on its own, though I certainly hope you found it that way, but because sitting with someone's grief for long enough eventually turns it into something closer to companionship than tragedy. By the time we reached that harbour in Sicily tonight, Anya was not simply a fact we mentioned once at the beginning and then left behind. She was still here with us quietly the entire time. I think that is really what this whole story's been about tonight, if I am honest with you, more than the bacterium itself, more than the genetics, more than the migrations and the mass graves and the careful patient science that let us reconstruct any of it in the first place. It has been about how remarkably little the actual experience of being human has changed across 5,000 years, even while almost everything else around us has changed beyond recognition. A mother's grief in Siberia and a mother's grief in medieval London are underneath everything the exact same feeling, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, and connected by something as small and as old as a single bacterium that never once stopped quietly moving through our shared history. We build cities now. We cure things that used to be an automatic death sentence. We can read a diagnosis out of a tooth smaller than a fingernail 5,000 years after the person wearing it took their last breath. And yet the feeling sitting underneath all of tonight's story, the fear of losing someone you love to something you cannot see or fully understand, has not needed a single update in all that time. It is, I think, one of the oldest and most stubbornly unchanged parts of what it actually means to be human. There is something almost comforting hidden inside a story this heavy, if you're willing to sit with it long enough to find it. Every single person we met tonight has been gone for thousands of years, and yet because of a shell midden that happened to preserve bone, because of a stone tomb that happened to be reopened generation after generation, because of patient, careful scientists willing to spend entire careers reading secrets out of fragments smaller than a fingernail, none of them are actually forgotten. Their stories survived in the quietest, most unlikely way imaginable long enough to be told properly by name, or at least by the names we gave them tonight, one more time 5,000 years later, to someone lying comfortably in the dark listening. That more than anything else is what I hope stays with you after tonight. Not fear of an ancient disease mostly tamed now by modern medicine. Something gentler than that. A quiet appreciation for how connected we actually are across a distance of time so vast it barely feels real to every person who has ever loved someone and feared losing them and kept going anyway. Thank you truly for spending this entire evening with me tonight. A story this long asks a real amount of your time and your attention, and if you're hearing these words right now, that means you stayed with me for well over 3 hours, all the way from that quiet Siberian shoreline to a crowded harbour in Sicily, and honestly, that alone deserves some kind of quiet applause. Falling asleep partway through is perfectly allowed too, by the way. That has always been part of the plan. If tonight's story moves something in you even a little, I would love to hear about it whenever you have a moment. Leave a comment down below if you feel like it. Tell me which part of tonight stuck with you the most, whether it was Anya or Antsis, or that lonely shaft in the English countryside. I look through every single one, and I always love seeing how differently the same story lands with different people scattered across every time zone imaginable. And if you enjoyed spending tonight this way, curled up somewhere comfortable while 5,000 years of history quietly unfolded around you, consider staying subscribed for whatever comes next. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, more quiet graves with entire lifetimes hidden inside them, more patient, careful science, ready to give voice to people history very nearly forgot completely. I would love to have you back for the next one. For now, let the lights stay low, let your eyes finally shut if they have not already, and know that there is another story waiting for you whenever you are ready for it. Until then, sleep well, and thank you sincerely for spending tonight with me.